Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You already know what happened on April 15th, 1912. The iceberg, the lifeboats, the heartbreak. What you don't know is what came next, when the world woke up and realised the unsinkable had, well, sunk. We're diving deep into the aftershock, the cover-ups, the quietly heroic and the utterly bizarre. And I should be honest with you right up front. You probably won't survive this. Not emotionally anyway. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It's not the neat ending they gave you in the movies. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's see how far and wide this sleepy little time machine travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting in a lifeboat. The darkness isn't pitch black anymore. It's more of a dull grey blue, like bruised skin, as the first streaks of dawn slip over the freezing Atlantic. Your hands are numb. Your feet, you stopped feeling them hours ago. Around you, the water stretches into a thin shimmering horizon, the colour of steel and sorrow. Bits of debris bob lazily. Chair legs, a half-sunk trunk, a woman's hat. Somewhere out there, someone's still calling for help, but not many. Most of the voices are gone now. You're one of the lucky ones, if that word means anything out here. The lifeboat you're in is overloaded, of course. Knees pressed against knees, strangers leaning on each other out of necessity, not comfort. A man in a steward's uniform is slumped beside you, eyes closed, lips cracked. A young boy next to him whispers, "Is that the rescue ship?" Every time someone sees a shadow on the horizon, but so far nothing but sea and sky. Then it comes, a puff of smoke first, barely noticeable against the pale dawn. Then a sliver of a ship, small at first, but growing. The RMS Carpathia, slicing through the waves, her engines pushed to the limit. She's not built for rescue, not built for this many people, but she's all you've got. As she gets closer, you can see crew members on deck, waving, throwing ropes, calling out. You don't cry because you can't, not anymore. The Carpathia had been 58 miles away when Titanic sent her first desperate wireless messages. You'll later learn that her radio operator, Harold Cottam, just happened to be listening. Pure chance. He caught Titanic's SOS, and in one of the most heroic decisions in maritime history, Captain Arthur Rostron ordered the ship turned around. Full speed ahead. He diverted all power to the engines, shut off heat and hot water for passengers, and steamed through dangerous ice fields in the dark. You were still drifting in that lifeboat while Carpathia risked everything to reach you by morning. When she finally pulls alongside your boat, the real nightmare begins. Climbing up a rope ladder with frozen hands. The panic of people being hauled up in makeshift canvas slings. Children separated from parents. Some too weak to move, carried aboard like broken dolls. One woman in your lifeboat refuses to go up. Keeps mumbling, "My husband's coming, I'm waiting for him." No one knows what to say. The decks of the Carpathia quickly turn into something between a triage tent and a morgue. Blankets, cocoa, hot soup. Anything warm is pressed into your hands. Crew members strip beds, give up their cabins, work without sleep. Some survivors huddle together in the first-class dining room, still in their nightgowns and slippers. Others collapse in corners, eyes hollow, whispering names of loved ones the sea has already taken. It's eerily quiet. No one's talking about what happened. Not yet. You don't even want to. Your brain keeps trying to convince you it wasn't real. Maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe the Titanic just floated off, and someone will find it any minute now. Spoiler, they won't. One woman walks the deck for hours searching the faces of survivors for her sister. Another insists her baby was taken aboard a different lifeboat. "They'll bring her soon," she says over and over. They don't. Not ever. Amid the chaos, something odd happens. A few passengers from the Carpathia, the ones who'd been peacefully heading to Europe before Titanic wrecked their itinerary, start complaining. "They've taken over our rooms," one man grumbles. "I paid good money for this cabin." You overhear it while trying to warm your hands near a boiler vent, and honestly, you don't even have the energy to be angry. What doesn't make it into most history books is just how weird this moment feels. You're alive, but the person who boarded Titanic, that confident version of you, they didn't make it. You're a different creature now, ghostly and still. And while Captain Rostron's heroism is legendary, he'll get medals, tributes, even an audience with the king, the Carpathia itself is just a temporary refuge, a liminal space, neither past nor future, just a floating purgatory stuffed with too many survivors and not nearly enough answers. And here's something quirky. As Carpathia continues picking up lifeboats, a rescue dog on board, a little terrier named Peggy, is credited by her handler with keeping spirits up. Some survivors even claim she barked whenever a lifeboat was near, like she could smell the hope. Of course, others say the dog was terrified and peed on a deck chair, so jury's still out. Speaking of juries, this won't end with the rescue, not even close. The moment Carpathia turns its bow toward New York, the real storm begins. Accusations, inquiries, and newspaper headlines written in blood. You're not just a survivor now, you're a witness. And the world is going to want a story. But for now, the only story that matters is this. You made it onto the Carpathia. The Atlantic didn't take you, not yet. The Carpathia is packed now, heavy not just with people, but with something thicker. Grief, disbelief, and the shared, unspoken question hanging in the air like cold fog. Why are we alive when so many aren't? You're leaning on the railing, your borrowed blanket pulled tight around your shoulders, watching the last few lifeboats be hauled in. It's almost mechanical at this point. Crew members pulling, survivors shuffling, ropes creaking. But then one of the lifeboats arrives, not with people, but with silence. Bodies. Cold. Stiff. Barely human shapes. There's a quiet shift on deck. No gasps. No screams. Just an awful kind of stillness as people look away. You do too. The ship isn't meant for this many souls. 200 maybe. But now there are over 700 people on board who weren't supposed to be here. They huddle in dining rooms, stairwells, lounges, anywhere they can find space to sit or collapse. The Carpathia's crew has given up their bunks. The second-class passengers are handing out coats and boots. The first-class ones, well, some are still irritated about the disruption, but you can't be mad about it. Their world just got shaken too, even if their diamond cufflinks are still shining. You move below deck. Everything feels warmer now, but not exactly safe. Survivors sit in little knots, whispering or not speaking at all. Some rock slowly, hugging their knees. Others just stare, unblinking. There's a young woman near you, barely 20, who keeps clutching her handbag like it holds her whole life. She hasn't said a word since she boarded. Another man, middle-aged, keeps muttering the same phrase. I told them we should have turned back. You don't ask. You don't want to know. Somewhere a wireless operator is still clicking out messages. He hasn't slept. His fingers are bandaged now, raw from relaying hours of urgent distress calls. Every few minutes he pauses, waiting for a reply. They're sparse. The world is just starting to wake up to the news and no one can believe it's real. Titanic. Titanic. Gone. You didn't see her go down, not really. You were already rowing when she broke in two, but others did. You overhear stories now, whispered between bites of broth or over borrowed mugs of coffee. One woman says she saw the stern lift skyward, with people clinging to the railings like flies. A fireman, his face like stone, describes the lights blinking out one by one. She screamed, he says. The ship, she screamed as she snapped. And you realise something awful. The ship itself was a character in this story. A villain, a victim, maybe both. Captain Rostron, who is now pacing somewhere on the bridge, has already sent the message. We are bringing survivors of Titanic disaster. Many require medical attention. He's calm, focused. If he's overwhelmed, he hides it well. You'll hear later how he organised lifeboats to be pulled up by priority. Injured first, women and children, then the rest. How he had hot soup ready before the first person even touched the deck. How he prayed with his crew before sunrise and ordered silence out of respect once the worst was clear. There's a fragile dignity to how this is handled, considering the scale of the loss. No one is yelling, no one is blaming. Not yet. It's too soon for fury. Right now, it's all survival, in the barest definition of the word. You live. That's it. That's your job now. Still, in between the horror, you catch glimpses of humanity. Someone quietly giving up their gloves. A teenager gently brushing a stranger's hair. One of the ship's cooks makes extra tea and sets it down beside anyone trembling. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels necessary. The bare minimum kindness that keeps the cold from winning. Of course, not everything is calm. In one corner, two survivors argue about whether the lifeboats could have returned to pick up more people. One insists they were ordered to stay away from the cries. The other says bitterly that the women on his boat refused to go back. Didn't want to hear the screams, he mutters. And again, silence falls like a curtain. Guilt will be the quietest passenger aboard this ship. And then there's the weird stuff. Because tragedy always brings weirdness. A rumour starts among some of the survivors that the iceberg was actually two icebergs fused together. Like some kind of ghost ice twin, even more unstoppable than the average frozen menace. No one can prove it, but the image takes root. Then there's a man who swears he saw a green light hovering above the iceberg. An omen, a hallucination. He's adamant. People nod politely. No one pushes him. In another room, a woman insists the Titanic didn't actually sink. She says it was an insurance scam, a switch with her sister ship Olympic. It's all fake, she whispers. We were never on the Titanic. You chalk it up to shock, but years from now, you'll hear that same theory spun into books, documentaries, even YouTube deep dives. And you'll remember her, this wild-eyed woman wrapped in 3 blankets, planting the seed of a legend. By the second day, people start to write. Letters home, diary entries, witness statements scribbled on hotel stationery. You find yourself doing the same. You need to make it real somehow. Otherwise, it's just flashes of memory. A woman falling, a violin still playing, the night sky glittering with indifference. You hear whispers that not all the officers survived, that Captain Smith is gone, that J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman, made it onto a lifeboat, and people are furious, that someone shot themselves, that steerage passengers were locked below decks. So many whispers, some true, some not, but all wrapped in this new mythology being born even as you sail toward land. As Carpathia churns toward New York, the mood begins to shift, from numb to anxious, from quiet grief to restless unease. Reporters are waiting, families are waiting, and you start to realize you're not going to be left alone. People will want your story, your face, your angle, but you're not ready, not yet. You don't even know who you are anymore, and that's when someone finally says it out loud. A nurse maybe, or one of the stewards. You survived the Titanic. And for a strange, surreal moment you wonder who they're talking about. New York City doesn't sleep much to begin with, but on the night the Carpathia arrives, it's practically holding its breath. You're still aboard, crammed into the railing alongside hundreds of other survivors, watching the flickering lights of the harbour grow closer, then brighter, until they stretch out like a constellation on land. Tugboats crowd the water, their horns wailing like ghosts. You can see crowds gathered at the pier already, pressed behind wooden barricades, waving handkerchiefs or holding signs scrawled with names. Some are crying. Others are stone-faced, waiting for news they're too afraid to hear. The dock is a blur of uniforms and flashbulbs. Police officers try to keep the crowd in check. Reporters yell questions before the gangway even lowers. A woman faints. Someone else tries to push past a guard, screaming for her sister. You're not sure where to look. Above you, the American flag flutters on the Carpathia's mast, solemn and proud, as if even it understands the moment. The first to disembark are the injured. You watch as they're carried down on stretchers, some with frostbitten limbs, others still unconscious. Behind them, the widowed mothers clutching children. Then more and more survivors shuffle down, one step at a time, blinking against the flash of cameras and the harsh sound of shouted names. You feel like a specimen, not a person. Like you've stepped into a theatre set, and the rest of the world has no idea what the play was about. You step onto the dock. It's solid beneath your feet, but your legs don't trust it. Reporters swarm like locusts. They push notepads toward your face, asking, "What did the iceberg look like? Did the captain shoot himself? Were third-class passengers really locked below? You say nothing, or maybe you mumble something about the cold, about a woman you never saw again, but it's all drowned out by the hunger in their pens. Police escort you to a temporary shelter, maybe a hotel lobby, maybe a church basement. You're not sure. Everything's soft carpet and scratchy wool blankets now. They offer you sandwiches, tea, warm towels. A nurse hands you a form to fill out: name, age, next of kin. You pause at that last part. The pen trembles in your hand. Next of kin. It's the first time the phrase feels like a threat. Outside, New Yorkers are restless. For days, conflicting reports dominated the newspapers. First, Titanic was fine, then it was damaged, then all rescued. Then suddenly, most were dead. People are confused, angry, and desperate for clarity. White Star Line offices had gone silent during the worst hours, refusing to confirm or deny anything. That vacuum of information was quickly filled with rumours. You hear about a man who burst into a Broadway theatre screaming, "Titanic's gone down," only to be thrown out as a drunk. He wasn't drunk. He just heard it on the wireless. Now, the truth is here, walking down gangways in borrowed coats and salt-stained dresses, and the city doesn't know what to do with you. Some families are waiting at the dock. Hugs, tears, screams, people collapsing in each other's arms. But many survivors are alone. The people they loved, spouses, parents, children, never made it off the ship. The Carpathia didn't carry them, the ocean did. And those people, your people, aren't coming home. The newspapers go into full overdrive. The New York Times runs a special edition. Headlines scream, "Titanic sinks with a 100 dead." You see your name misprinted in one article, listed among the lost. It's bizarre. A piece of you is officially dead according to some typesetter with a deadline. A reporter corners you later and asks how you feel. You say, "Cold." He writes down "heroic." Somewhere else in the city, J. Bruce Ismay is in hiding. Chairman of the White Star Line, once a symbol of power and confidence, he's now being branded a coward. You hear people call him J. Brute Ismay. He made it onto a lifeboat, yes, but his reputation didn't. And when word gets out that he's refused to speak to the press, the tabloids go wild. He lives while children drown, one headline screams. It's a catchy narrative, too catchy to resist, whether or not it's entirely fair. Meanwhile, the city scrambles to respond. Makeshift aid stations pop up overnight. Hotel rooms are donated. Charities organise immediate funds. The Red Cross starts collecting blankets and money. And just like that, you're no longer just a person. You're a cause. People want to help you, photograph you, quote you. A few want to profit from you. You hear whispers of playwrights drafting Titanic scripts before the ink on the death toll is even dry. But it's not all noise and opportunism. There are letters waiting for survivors, hundreds of them. Strangers writing to offer condolences, homes, money. One woman opens a letter from a baker in Ohio who offers to pay her rent for a year. Another is handed a note that simply reads, "You're not alone. I lost my son too." You watch her read it 3 times and fold it into her sleeve. The night passes strangely. You sleep in spurts, waking to city sounds that feel too loud, too alive. The rattle of a trolley, a newsboy shouting headlines, a baby crying in a hallway. You wish you were still on the Carpathia, weirdly enough. It was quieter there. You think you left a part of yourself in the North Atlantic, bobbing on a black sea with stars like knives in the sky. And maybe the weirdest thing of all, nobody really knows how to talk to you. They want to know everything, and yet they flinch when you start to tell them. People ask how cold the water was, then change the subject halfway through your answer. One man pats you on the back and says, "Well, God must have had a reason for saving you," and walks away before you can say anything. Some of the survivors, especially the wealthier ones, are already planning their return to England. You overhear them booking passage on ships. Yes, ships. Can you imagine? After all that, they're ready to step right back onto a deck and trust it won't split in half. You feel a cold sweat just thinking about the idea. But it's not just fear, it's confusion. You still don't understand how such a massive, glamorous, supposedly invincible ship could vanish in less than 3 hours. And no one seems to have a straight answer. The story is already fragmenting. Some say the ship turned too late, others blame cheap rivets. A few claim there weren't enough lookouts. Then there's the iceberg itself, a floating wall of frozen death, now long gone, drifting silently into obscurity. And that's what begins to gnaw at you. Late that night in a borrowed cot in a borrowed room in a city that's trying to mourn something it still doesn't understand. The iceberg didn't sink the Titanic. People did. People made the decisions. People ignored the warnings. People built the lifeboats for appearances, not survival. But no one wants to talk about that yet. They just want to hear your story. And maybe, just maybe, twist it into something they can live with. You wake up to the sound of footsteps, heels clicking, boots scuffing across tile, and the low murmur of conversations in too many languages. The sun's up, but you can't feel it. The city's alive again, noisy, impatient, and already Titanic is fading into myth. You're standing by the window now, wrapped in a coat someone loaned you, watching as more survivors are ushered into taxis and press vans, bundled off to who knows where. Some are going to family, others to hotels, hospitals, charity shelters. You're still not sure where you belong. The Carpathia's done her duty. Her decks are empty now, wiped down and washed clean like the whole thing was a strange salty fever dream. Captain Rostron refuses interviews. He said what he came to say and now just wants his ship back. You don't blame him. He'll get medals, sure, but also a lifetime of nightmares. You saw it in his face. Calm, brave, but haunted. You recognize it in yourself now. In the mirror, your own eyes look like someone else's. Older, maybe. Or just more aware. Reporters are still swarming the survivors who remain. They're publishing personal stories now, hunting for quotes, for drama, for sobs and tear-streaked faces. And some survivors are talking. Too much, maybe. One man claims he helped row a lifeboat the whole night with a broken arm. Another insists he saw the band playing Nearer, My God, to thee until the very last moment. People love that one. The band playing as the ship sinks. What a perfect detail. Maybe too perfect. You start to realise something unsettling. This story is no longer yours. It's being rewritten by strangers. Already the Titanic is becoming more than what it was. Less a tragedy, more a symbol. People need it to mean something, to teach something. But you? You're still trying to remember what your last meal on board was. You think it was soup. Then you get called into a room, you and a dozen other survivors. A clean, well-dressed man hands out forms. These are from the White Star Line. They want information. Where you boarded, what class you were, what belongings you lost, if you're injured, if you're planning to sue. The form doesn't ask if you're emotionally wrecked, or if you wake up hearing screams. Just, please, itemize your personal effects. You stare at the blank space where it says value in dollars. You hesitate. How do you put a price on the photo you left on your nightstand? Lawyers are already circling. You overhear the word liability more times than you care to count. The legal machine is waking up, sluggish and greedy. Soon there will be lawsuits, claims, settlements. No one really knows how much a life is worth. The courts will try to decide anyway. Outside, the city has started selling Titanic postcards. Street vendors carry them by the dozen. Drawings of the ship, of the iceberg, of sinking lifeboats rendered in watercolour. One even has the words "Souvenir of the Great Tragedy," printed in gold ink. You can't decide if it's offensive or just inevitable. You wander into a diner later that day. The waitress recognises you, not personally, just as a survivor. She sets down a bowl of stew and says, "On the house." You thank her. She pauses before walking away. "You saw it sink, didn't you?" she asks. You nod. "God," she whispers. "God must have been watching out for you." You try to smile. You're too tired to explain that you weren't saved by God. You were saved by a lifeboat. At another table, two men are loudly debating whether the Titanic really broke in half. One says yes. He read it in the paper. The other scoffs. "That's nonsense," he says. "Ships don't break in two like a matchstick." You quietly wipe your mouth, pay the tip someone else left for you, and walk out before they ask for your opinion. Back in your hotel room, there's a knock. A woman stands there, tall, thin, veiled. She introduces herself as Margaret Brown, though everyone's calling her the unsinkable Molly Brown in the papers now. She has a force of nature kind of energy. She's a survivor too, and she's already organising relief efforts for the poorer. Passengers, Irish immigrants, Syrian families, third-class women with nowhere to go. You've heard she argued with crewmen in her lifeboat, forced them to turn back to look for survivors. That kind of stubbornness carries. She presses an envelope into your hand. "For anything you need," she says. "Don't be shy about asking for more." She's not the only one. Across the city, fundraisers are happening in churches, theatres, even department stores. Millionaires are offering aid. Volunteers are collecting shoes, clothes, blankets. For a moment, you're overwhelmed. Not just by grief or fatigue, but by how deeply people want to help. Strangers. People who weren't even there. It almost makes the whole thing feel survivable. Almost. But not everything fits neatly into that uplifting frame. You meet another man later that evening, a fellow second-class passenger. He tells you his story in a voice as dry as sand. How he watched a collapsible lifeboat flip over. How he clung to it with 30 others until the Carpathia arrived. How one man froze to death while still holding his wife's hand. "They say we're lucky," he mutters. "I feel like a thief, like I stole someone else's place." That sticks with you. The idea that survival isn't just about luck or bravery, but about accident. That maybe you're alive because of a whim of fate, or someone else's sacrifice. And that's the part no one wants to hear about. The uglier truths, the lifeboats that left half empty, the officers with pistols, the passengers who pushed, the ones who were pushed. You overhear a reporter talking about a woman who gave birth the morning after she arrived in New York. Her husband had drowned. She named the baby Hope. He writes it down like it's poetry. But you know the woman. You saw her crying into a wool coat on the Carpathia's deck, whispering a name over and over that wasn't Hope. This isn't a neat story, and it never will be. But already, people are trying to make it one. They're turning it into a cautionary tale, or a romance, or a lesson about class. You can feel yourself being packaged, your pain carved into digestible pieces for public consumption. And honestly, you're too tired to stop them. The next morning, you're escorted into a grand building. Marble floors, velvet chairs, the kind of place where everything echoes. A courtroom, though it doesn't feel like justice yet. More like a very elegant interrogation chamber. This is the opening of the US Senate inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic, and you apparently are now a witness, a piece of evidence with a pulse. They usher you in with other survivors, some of whom you recognise from the Carpathia, others you've only read about in the papers. Everyone looks slightly too clean, as if freshly scrubbed and redressed by people who don't know what trauma smells like. The senators are already seated. Big names, important faces. Senator William Alden. Smith, the man in charge, is presiding with the kind of stiffness that makes his chair look like a throne. He's not a sailor, not a mariner, but he has a point to prove, that American passengers died and someone is going to be held accountable, preferably with a gavel. It's strange watching a tragedy be translated into protocol. There's a stenographer in the corner, clacking away on her machine, capturing every question, every faltering answer. It all becomes transcript, official, lifeless. Your suffering is being itemised. Again. First up are the crew members. You watch a surviving officer take the stand. His uniform is pressed, but the man inside it is unravelling. He's asked how many lifeboats there were, how they were launched, whether passengers were separated by class, whether orders were given to prioritise women and children. His voice trembles, but not from nerves, from remembering, from knowing that every answer is a minefield. Then they call J. Bruce Ismay. The room shifts. Everyone leans forward just a little. The villain of the week has entered the chat. Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, the man who stepped into a lifeboat while so many others didn't. He's pale, thinner than he was in the newspaper sketches. His moustache is trembling ever so slightly. But he doesn't cry. Not once. He sits down and answers the questions like a man dissecting his own ghost. They ask, did he encourage Captain Smith to increase speed? Did he know how many lifeboats were on board? Did he think he deserved a seat in that lifeboat? Ismay replies carefully, cautiously, always circling back to his official role. He says he didn't take anyone else's place, that no women or children were near when he boarded, that he helped others into boats first. Some believe him, some don't. One senator leans in and asks, would you not say, Mr. Ismay, that in a case such as this the captain should be the last to leave and the managing director should not leave at all? It lands like a slap. The room goes quiet. You feel it in your gut. the weight of blame hanging in the air like heavy fog. But it's not just about Ismay. They're asking everyone everything. Survivors are quizzed on how the iceberg was spotted, how long it took the ship to sink, how people behaved on deck. You hear conflicting stories. Some say there was calm, order, even chivalry. Others describe panic, chaos, guns fired into the air. One woman insists the ship split clean in two before going under. A senator frowns. That doesn't match the official version, but it will, eventually. Meanwhile, out in the corridors, the press are having a feeding frenzy. Headlines are being written in real time. Ismay weeps on the stand. Senators grill Titanic crew. Survivors tell harrowing tales. Some of it's true, some of it isn't. One paper claims the iceberg was the size of Rhode Island. Another says it glowed green like an alien ship, the Titanic. Isn't just news now, it's theatre. And you're part of the cast, whether you signed up for it or not. During a break, you find yourself in a hallway with a man who introduces himself as a stoker from below decks. His hands are still blistered. He tells you they saw the iceberg coming too late and tried to close the watertight doors, but the water came in like a fist. He says the ship was built to survive 4 compartments flooding, but 5 were breached. He says if the steel had held better, maybe you wouldn't be here talking at all. Later, a senator floats a theory that the Titanic sank because the rivets were substandard. Someone else blames poor binocular access for the lookouts. Another suggests the wireless operators were too busy with passengers' telegrams to relay the iceberg warnings. Every theory is someone's attempt to explain the unthinkable, to fix it with logic, to patch a hole in reality the size of a ship. You're called up finally. The chair is hard. The senators are polite but firm. They ask what you saw, where you were, how you got into a lifeboat. You try to keep it factual. But when you start to describe the moment you realise the ship wasn't just sinking, it was dying, your voice breaks. Just for a second. Long enough for the senator to nod and move on. No follow-up. They've got a schedule to keep. After your testimony, you're escorted out the back to avoid the press. But one journalist still corners you by the elevator. Did it feel like a betrayal, he asks. You blink. What? To be told the ship was unsinkable, and then to be left with nothing? You don't answer. He writes that you nodded solemnly. You didn't. Later, in a small cafe down the block, you meet another survivor who's furious. He says the Senate hearings are just for show. They'll write their report, he grumbles, and nothing will change. You'll see. You don't want to believe him. But you remember the lifeboats. How few there were. How many were launched half full. And you wonder. The inquiry lasts weeks. Survivors come and go. The senators grow weary. You do too. Eventually they issue a report. It says the ship was going too fast, that the iceberg warnings weren't acted on, that the lack of lifeboats was indefensible, but also that no criminal wrongdoing occurred. Just mistakes, oversights, a perfect storm of human error and overconfidence. You sit with that for a long time. It turns out that when something truly horrific happens, people want answers, but not too many. Not the kind that point fingers too hard or climb too high up the chain of command. The ship sank. The world mourned. Let's move on. But you won't. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever. You arrive in London to a very different atmosphere. Cooler, quieter, and far more restrained. As if grief here is something to be folded and put in a drawer. You're one of many survivors returning across the Atlantic, and the moment you step onto the dock at Southampton, you notice the change. No mobs of reporters, no wailing families at the gates, just long, silent looks from people who don't quite know what to say to someone who's come back from a ship that wasn't supposed to fail. Your feet hit British soil again, and for a moment it feels like you've returned to some previous version of reality. Cobblestones, grey skies, a familiar chill. But even the air smells different. Less of salt and more of expectation. Word has spread already. Titanic is gone. The news has moved from shock to process. The questions have begun. A few days later, you're summoned to appear at the British Board of Trade Inquiry, held in a grand hall that looks like it was designed for coronations, not court. There's brass everywhere, and a panel of commissioners who wear their dignity like armour. At the head of it all is Lord Mersey, who manages to look both grandfatherly and judicial at the same time. His job? Get to the bottom of what happened without ruffling too many aristocratic feathers. You sit in the gallery watching the first witnesses speak. Shipbuilders, officers, engineers. The line of questioning is polite, technical. Where the American inquiry had fire, this one has formality. You quickly learn that Britain's pride is very much on trial. Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a British ship built in Belfast, crewed largely by British men, designed as a floating statement of industrial supremacy. And now it lies in pieces on the ocean floor. As the hearings unfold, one thing becomes clear. Nobody wants to blame the system. They're quite comfortable blaming icebergs, fate, and the regrettable speed of the vessel. But ask whether shipping regulations should change, and suddenly people start clearing their throats and dodging eye contact. You see officers fumble when asked why lifeboats were launched half full. One admits he wasn't trained for emergencies. Another insists there was no panic. You feel your stomach tighten at that one. What bothers you isn't just the gaps in memory. It's the suggestion that everything happened as it should have. The crew performed admirably under the circumstances, someone says. No evidence of cowardice, another insists. You look down at your hands. You remember the man who climbed over others to reach the lifeboat. The officer who waved his pistol and told people to back off or else. You remember the screams from the water. Are those memories just yours now? There's also the class divide, as thick and obvious as the mahogany panelling on the walls. First-class passengers are given the most time, the most polite questions. Their accounts are treated like gospel. Third-class passengers, they're called steerage, and some are questioned like stowaways. You watch a young Irish woman give her testimony, her voice shaking as she describes trying to find the stairs to the boat deck, only to find them locked. The commissioner frowns. "Are you sure they were locked?" he asks. She nods. "Yes, sir, we were kept below." He scribbles something but doesn't ask her anything else. You're not surprised when the White Star Line's legal team steps in later to clarify that no such barriers were officially in place. Officially. You sit there, furious, wanting to say something, but you're not called again. They have enough voices, apparently. Enough curated quotes to patch together a tidy report. Still, not all of it is polished spin. The inquiry does produce facts, some of them brutal. Yes, the lifeboats were criminally inadequate. Yes, iceberg warnings were ignored. Yes, the ship was going faster than it should have been. But these are framed as errors in judgment, not flaws in the system. Lord Mersey himself seems reluctant to place blame. His tone is sympathetic, patriotic. You wonder if that's the point, to preserve the Empire's dignity, not to learn anything truly painful. There's also an unspoken tension hovering in the background. Britain's shipping industry is a pillar of its economy. To admit that Titanic's construction or operation was flawed would shake public trust in the whole system. So instead, the inquiry gently leans toward lessons learned rather than mistakes made. You feel it in every careful phrase. A tragedy, but not a scandal. The difference matters. At one point, a quirky little sidebar emerges. A debate over whether Titanic had tried to race across the Atlantic to break speed records. Some survivors say yes. Others say absolutely not. One newspaper even prints a claim that there was a prize involved for the fastest crossing. It turns out to be nonsense, but that doesn't stop people from repeating it. It's a comforting lie, that maybe Titanic died because it was too ambitious, too bold. Better that than admitting it sank because safety was sacrificed for luxury. And then there's the iceberg. At the inquiry, someone suggests that the ship should have had better ice patrols. Another person wonders why the binoculars were locked up and inaccessible to the lookouts. This becomes a point of minor obsession. The missing key. The unopened locker. It feels like the perfect metaphor, something small, overlooked and utterly consequential. A single key, lost in the shuffle, and now more than 1,500 people are dead. That kind of narrative writes itself. One day during the hearings, you find yourself sitting beside a surviving steward. He tells you about the moment the iceberg hit. The lurch, the sound, like a monstrous hand dragging fingernails across steel. He says, "It was like God scratched the ship open." You don't say anything, but the image follows you. When the final report comes out, it's everything you expected and nothing you wanted. The sinking is deemed the result of excessive speed in dangerous waters. compounded by the lack of lifeboats and failure to heed warnings, but no one is blamed outright. Captain Smith, conveniently dead, is praised as a brave man. Ismay's actions are described as regrettable, but not criminal. The Board of Trade, the very body conducting the inquiry, is cleared of wrongdoing. A neat little circle of accountability. Everyone's sorry, but no one's guilty. Still, changes do come, slowly. International conventions begin drafting new rules. Lifeboats for all. Lifeboat drills become mandatory. Ice patrols are proposed. But you can't help but feel it's all too late. Titanic already lies broken at the bottom of the sea, and hundreds of voices are trapped there with it. On your way out of the final hearing, you walk past a newsboy holding a fresh stack of papers. The headline reads, "Titanic tragedy ends in reforms." You keep walking, because for you, and for the others who lived through it, the tragedy doesn't end. It just echoes. You don't notice it at first. Not really. You're too busy trying to keep your footing in the world again, dodging questions, avoiding crowded rooms, forgetting what it felt like to drift in open water while people screamed around you. But then, slowly, you start to see it. How the story of the Titanic is changing right in front of your eyes. The press isn't just reporting anymore, they're creating, shaping, twisting real horror into something shinier, more sellable. You pick up a newspaper at a corner stand and barely recognise the event you lived through. The headlines are getting bolder now, more theatrical. Titanic's final ball. Band played to their doom. Captain's last words. Be British. There's something almost cinematic about it. Like people can't help but rewrite the ending. The facts don't matter as much anymore. It's the feeling they want. The arc. The poetry of it. You read a column that describes lifeboats calmly lowering while the ship tips like a sigh into the sea. The writer makes it sound like a slow dance. You think of the screams, the splintering decks, the water swallowing mothers with babies still in their arms, and you want to burn the paper in your hands. But it's everywhere now. Reporters camp outside survivors' homes. Some even pretend to be relatives just to get through the door. You know one woman, second class, quiet, middle-aged, who gets paid to reenact her escape for a magazine sketch artist. She climbs into a rowboat in a studio while a man draws her in pencil. They sell the image on postcards. She doesn't say no because she needs the money. Who doesn't? You also hear stories that make you laugh, though not kindly. One tabloid claims the iceberg was cursed, chipped from a haunted glacier and fated to strike Titanic from the moment it calved. Another prints a letter supposedly from a psychic who felt the ship's doom weeks in advance. That same paper says a mummy from the British Museum was smuggled aboard and brought bad luck. You wait for the one that says a sea monster did it. And then come the villains. Oh, how they love a villain. Ismay is still their favourite, the man who fled. The coward in the lifeboat. Never mind that several other men survived under identical circumstances. Ismay had power. He had a name. That made him easier to hate. A cartoon in one Sunday paper shows him in a dress, climbing into a boat while women drown behind him. The caption reads, "Ladies first, except when you're the boss." Another depicts Captain Smith as a stoic Roman, standing at the helm with his arms crossed backlit by flames. You don't even know if he was standing. Nobody does. Survivors are suddenly celebrities, if they're tragic enough. The young ones, the beautiful ones, the rich ones. A first-class heiress is offered a book deal. A child from steerage is put on stage at a fundraiser to sing a hymn and make the crowd cry. You're asked to give a talk in a town you've never heard of. They want you to wear your life jacket. You decline, politely, but not everyone says no. One man, you recognise him from the Carpathia's deck, goes on tour, charges admission for public talks, signs autographs. His flyer reads, "The night Titanic died, a first-hand account of bravery in ice." You sit in the back at one of his talks. Listen as he spins a tale you don't recognise. He claims he was the last man to leave the ship, that he gave up his place for a child, then swam 3 miles through icy water to a lifeboat. He says he never cried, never panicked, just did his duty. The crowd gives him a standing ovation. You slip out the back before anyone sees you. It's not all showmanship, though. Some people genuinely want to help. Artists paint tributes. Poets write ballads. A composer pens a solemn march for orchestra. Churches hold memorial services lit by candlelight. There's something sacred in those moments, even if it's still steeped in myth. But for every hymn, there's a chorus of voices twisting the truth into whatever sells best. One pamphlet declares that Titanic was an indictment of modern hubris. Another calls it the last dance of the old world, whatever that means. Everyone wants the ship to symbolise something: progress gone too far, class injustice, industrial arrogance. You sit in a pub and overhear a man say, "It had to happen, didn't it? Just look at the size of the thing, it was asking for it." He says this like it's obvious, like a giant ship sinking and taking over 1,500 people with it is just the ocean's version of putting someone in their place. That's when it really hits you. How fast people have moved on from the people, the actual humans who died. Their names are being flattened into footnotes. John, who held his daughter until the waves took them both. Fatima, who never found her brother again. Mr. and Mrs. Harper, who gave up their seat so newlyweds could escape. You remember their faces, but the world is already swapping them for more photogenic ghosts. Even the band becomes myth. Their names aren't remembered, just the idea of them. A string quartet playing on a tilting deck, serenading death itself. There's debate now about which song they played last. Some say, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Others claim it was Autumn. And you? You don't know. You weren't close enough to hear. But that doesn't stop people from asking. And when they do, they look at you like you're supposed to confirm their version. You just smile and let them have it. Then one day you find a book in a shop window. Titanic, an illustrated tragedy. The cover shows a ship, bow raised, splitting in half like a movie scene. That didn't happen, or at least nobody believes it yet. The official story still says she sank whole, but the artist doesn't care. It's drama that matters, a good story. You stare at it for a long time, then walk away without going inside. By the end of the week, a theatre opens a play based on the disaster. Full cast, orchestra, even fake water on stage. You hear people cried during the lifeboat scene, that they applauded when the captain stood tall and faced his fate. Someone hands you a flyer as you pass by the theatre. "Come relive the great ship's final voyage," it says. You crumple it in your pocket, because you don't want to relive it. You want to forget, but the world won't let you. It's a quiet evening, and you're sitting in a friend's parlour, sipping lukewarm tea from a porcelain cup that's too delicate for how you feel inside. The conversation swirls around you, low and cautious, like people speaking in a museum. Someone finally says it out loud, "But I thought Titanic was unsinkable." And there it is. That word, that myth, unsinkable. It hangs in the room like steam from the tea, thick and strange, as if someone's just whispered a spell and now everyone's waiting for the ghost to appear. You think back, really think about that word. You don't remember ever hearing it on board. None of the crew ever said it. The passengers didn't walk around bragging that the ship couldn't go down. The mood on Titanic was confident, sure, but not arrogant. It felt safe, big, solid, a city floating on dark water. But unsinkable. That word didn't echo across the decks. It didn't ripple through the corridors or float above the dining tables. Not until after it sank. You tell them that, gently, but they shake their heads. No, everyone knew. It was all over the papers before she sailed. One man pulls out a newspaper clipping from a drawer. It's old, creased and slightly yellowed. A press piece from before the voyage, quoting a White Star representative saying Titanic was practically unsinkable. That word again, practically. A tiny hedge. The kind of word people skip when they're telling a story over dinner. The truth is muddled like most things. The shipbuilders at Harland and Wolff designed Titanic with 16 watertight compartments. Advanced engineering for the time. The theory was that if up to 4 flooded, the ship would still float. But theory isn't the same as reality. Icebergs don't respect theory. And now, long after the ship has gone down, people need something simple to blame. Arrogance is easy. Saying they thought it was unsinkable gives the disaster a neat little moral. Human pride brought low. Hubris punished. Cue the Greek chorus. It makes a better story than they underestimated nature, overestimated steel, and didn't put enough lifeboats on board. Some survivors try to push back against the myth. You meet one at a memorial event. An older woman in black lace who insists to the gathered crowd, "None of us ever said she couldn't sink. We just believed she wouldn't." There's a difference, a big one, but no one seems to hear her. They're already lighting candles and whispering about man's arrogance. Meanwhile, brochures and exhibits start popping up, showcasing Titanic's design like she was an antique cathedral. Diagrams of her engines, her dining rooms, her swimming pool — yes, she had a swimming pool — are printed and handed out like holy relics. You visit a small museum display in Liverpool where a child points at a model and says, "See, Daddy, she was unsinkable until she wasn't." And you realise that's how people will remember it. Not the way it actually happened, but the way it feels like it should have happened. And here's something even stranger. The word unsinkable wasn't even widely used in Titanic's original advertising. You checked. Most of the pamphlets called her luxurious, modern, fast. But it only took one or two headlines, one or two embellished quotes, and suddenly the whole world remembers Titanic as the ship that couldn't sink. Until it did. The irony is irresistible. The newspapers run op-eds about how mankind has become too proud, about how Titanic was a warning from God, or fate, or the sea itself, a punishment for human arrogance. One preacher calls it the Tower of Babel with a smokestack. You roll your eyes, not because he's wrong, necessarily, but because it's so easy. People want disasters to be parables, simple, digestible, and nothing says cautionary tale like the word unsinkable, sinking into the cold Atlantic. It becomes a punchline in political cartoons. A society woman sitting atop a champagne bottle labelled Titanic, with a caption that reads, "Not even ice can spoil our party." Another shows a businessman trying to row a sinking stock market graph, the word unsinkable stamped on the side. Everyone gets the joke. You start hearing it in conversations about other things too. A new bridge? It's the Titanic of engineering? A shaky marriage? They think it's unsinkable. It's cultural shorthand now, you can't escape it. You're invited to speak at a school one afternoon. Just a small classroom, a history, teacher, and 24 wide-eyed students who ask careful questions. One boy raises his hand and says, "Why didn't they just build more lifeboats?" You pause. He's the only one to ask that all day. You want to hug him. But instead, you explain that the Board of Trade's regulations hadn't been updated in years. Ships had grown bigger, but the safety laws hadn't. Titanic actually exceeded the legal requirement for lifeboats, but only because the law was based on tonnage, not capacity. It was like applying tricycle rules to a freight train. That stuns them, and it stuns you too every time you say it out loud, because no one wants to admit that the most advanced ship in the world was brought down by outdated rules and a lack of benches. Later, one of the students asks if you think people learned anything. You tell her yes, but they learned the wrong thing. They learned not to say something is unsinkable. They didn't necessarily learn to make sure it doesn't sink. It's not all bleak though. The word does eventually push reform. Maritime safety improves, lifeboat drills become mandatory, ice patrols are established. But still, the idea persists. Titanic sank because people believed it couldn't. It's a myth too convenient to die. And in a strange way, the ship becomes more powerful in death than it ever was in life. A cautionary icon, a warning label. Her wreck lies on the ocean floor, broken in two, rusting in silence. But up here, she's immortal. In classrooms, in headlines, on dinner plates shaped like her hull. You find it surreal. You find it exhausting. But one day, you catch yourself using it too. You're describing a friend's reckless optimism and you say, "He's got a Titanic mindset. Thinks he's unsinkable." The words leave your mouth before you can stop them. You freeze, and then you laugh. Because you're part of it now. You lived through it, and now you're helping to write the myth one careless sentence at a time. That's the real legacy, isn't it? Not just the ship or the iceberg or even the loss. It's the stories we choose to tell after. It's late, and you're sitting by a crackling fireplace in a little boarding house outside Liverpool, the kind with floral wallpaper and ticking clocks in every room. Outside, the streets are slick with mist, and every lamppost seems to carry a halo. You're not alone. A few other survivors are here too, quiet lodgers who keep to themselves during the day but gather like moths in the evening, drawn to the warmth of someone who understands. The talk always starts the same way, stiff, shallow, safe. But eventually someone leans forward, lowers their voice, and says something real. Tonight it's George. a fireman from Titanic's engine crew. His face is raw with old coal burns and the kind of grief that settles in behind your ribs and builds a nest. He talks about the night she went down, not in grand gestures or dramatic detail, but in fragments. I remember the floor tilting, furnace doors swinging open, and the steam. God, the steam, it howled like a living thing. You listen, like you always do, because you know that once the story starts flowing it can't be stopped, and maybe shouldn't. It's these unsung voices that never make the newspapers. The stewards, the stokers, the musicians, the nurses. People who moved beneath the surface of Titanic's glamorous decks, making things work while the first-class guests dined under chandeliers. Now, in the aftermath, they're either forgotten or flattened into one-line footnotes in stories where they were the backbone. But here, around this fire, they remember each other. And you start to realise how many heroes no one ever wrote about. You hear about Albert, the junior wireless operator who stayed at his post until the power failed completely. He was only 20. Or John, a pantry steward who carried a toddler to safety and then went back down below to help load lifeboats. He didn't come back. No statue, no plaque. Just a story passed around like a secret handshake. Then there's the baker. Yes, the baker. Charles Jewin. You remember his name because no one who met him ever forgot it. According to stories, he survived the freezing water by clinging to an overturned lifeboat, completely drunk. They say he downed half a bottle of liquor before the ship went under, and somehow the alcohol kept his body from freezing. It sounds ridiculous, like something made up at a bar, but he gave testimony, lived through it, swam in water that killed most people in minutes. Sometimes survival isn't pretty or poetic, sometimes it's absurd. You chuckle when George brings him up. "Boozy old Charles," he says, grinning into his tea, floated like a cork. You both know it's not that simple, but the laughter helps. It always does. And then there are the Marconigrams, the wireless messages. You meet a man who's collected transcripts of them, line by line like sacred texts, distress calls, position reports, frantic replies from ships too far away to help. You read them one evening, your fingers trembling over the fading type. It's like listening to ghosts speak across time. There's one message, sent just before the Carpathia responded. "We have struck iceberg. Come at once." So flat. So calm. You imagine someone typing that while the deck listed under their feet and people cried in the corridors. The wireless operators don't get enough credit, you think. They sent messages until the ship lost power, long after any sane person would have run. Harold Bride, the surviving operator, was found half frozen on a lifeboat, feet crushed, still clutching a telegraph key. No medals for him. Just stories whispered in quiet corners like this one. You begin writing them down. The names, the strange facts, the tiny details that don't make it into official reports, like how the baker swam without freezing, or how a steward turned back 3 times to help strangers, or how a second-class girl gave up her seat for a maid who'd lost her family. No one asked her to. She just did it, and drowned. And there's the violinist, Wallace Hartley. You didn't know him personally, but his legend is everywhere now. How he and his band kept playing as the ship listed, trying to keep people calm. No one's sure what the last song was. Some swear it was Nearer, My God to Thee. Others say it was Autumn. Doesn't matter. He played. They all did. Musicians who'd never practiced for terror, never been trained in death. Just regular men, standing in the cold, using the only tool they had to fight the panic. His body was found with his music case still strapped to his chest. That part's true. You saw the report. Sometimes you wonder if the band played because they thought the ship would hold, or because they knew it wouldn't. There's something defiant in that image. A string quartet refusing to run, insisting that if they were going down, they'd do it in harmony. But you also remember a woman, older, one of the few from third class who made it to a lifeboat. She once told you that while everyone else praises the band, she couldn't stand the music that night. "It made it worse," she said, eyes glassy. "It was too calm, like we were supposed to accept it." For her, the soundtrack wasn't noble. It was eerie, manipulative even. Another layer of control in a moment when no one had any. It's one of the things no one agrees on. Was the band an act of courage, or just another symbol we've inflated into comfort? You write that down too. The survivors you meet in those months after the sinking, all those who aren't in newspapers or in front of cameras, They're the ones who give you the clearest picture of what happened. Not just the facts, but the texture of it. The smells, the sounds, the way the ship groaned before it snapped, the cries that stayed in their ears for weeks, the way no one could sleep with the light off anymore. You keep their names, not just in your head but in a little notebook. You don't want to forget them, because the world already has. It's too busy arguing about whether Titanic was doomed from the start or whether it was just unlucky, whether Captain Smith was brave or foolish, whether Ismay was a coward or a scapegoat. The loud debates never seem to include the quiet ones. The cooks, the boilermen, the stewardesses who handed out life jackets and led panicked children up the stairs. The people who didn't get statues, the ones whose names were spelled wrong in the obituaries. But here, in this little room filled with people who lived it, their stories are remembered, shared like sacred threads. Not polished, not poetic, just real. And that, you think, might be the truest form of history there is. You leave the city one morning and find yourself in a quiet fishing village along the Irish coast, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business before breakfast, and the sea is more of a neighbour than a view. You're here to visit a family that never got a telegram, never got a body back, just a silence that stretched across their home like a second roof. The man who died was named Liam, a third-class passenger, a farmer's son. He was headed for a new life in America, or at least he was supposed to be. You were told the family wanted to speak to someone who had survived. Not for closure, because there isn't any, but for something like connection. They've read the papers, they've seen the headlines, but they haven't heard a voice from the lifeboats. They want to ask the questions the newspapers never do. Was it fast? Was it cold? Did he have a chance? Did he know what was happening? You don't have the answers, but you go anyway. You go because it feels like the right thing to do. The cottage is small, whitewashed, with smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the kitchen smells of peat and old bread. Liam's mother sits at the table, her hands folded around a chipped mug. She doesn't cry. She's cried all her tears already. She just looks at you like you're a letter she's waited too long to open. You sit with her for an hour, maybe two. You describe what the night was like, what the sea felt like, what it sounded like when the ship split apart. She doesn't flinch. She listens with the stillness of stone. At one point she asks if it's true that the third-class passengers were kept below. You hesitate. Say yes. Say no one admitted it officially, but that's how it felt. That the stairways were locked or hard to find. That crew didn't explain clearly. That panic filled the air long before water did. She nods once, says, "That sounds about right." You learn that Liam had never been on a ship before, that he carried a pouch of coins sewn into the lining of his coat, that he wanted to open a bar in Boston with his cousin, that he played fiddle on Sundays, and that he wrote a letter to his mother from Queenstown the day before he boarded, saying, "I'll be home again in 5 years, with money and stories." Now she only has the story of his death, and she doesn't even get to tell it. Across town in a churchyard, you pass a row of fresh gravestones, but none for Liam. His body was never recovered. Most weren't. Instead, his name is written on a small plaque inside the chapel. Just that. A name. No date of death. Just lost on the Titanic. This is what's left behind when ships go down. The people who don't get a headline or a photograph in the paper. The families who wait for letters that never come. Mothers who leave a candle burning in the window, months after the rest of the world has moved on to the next scandal. And this is just one family. In towns across Ireland, England, Syria, Sweden, Lebanon and France, the same story plays out over and over. A father gone, a daughter missing, brother lost in cold water. You travel for weeks and see it everywhere. The quiet aftermath. The chair that isn't sat in anymore. The coat that still hangs by the door. The room no one goes into. You visit a neighbourhood in Belfast where a group of shipbuilders gather every Friday in the pub to drink and talk about what they made. The Titanic was their masterpiece, and her sinking was a wound they still poke at, even now. Some blame White Star, some blame the sea, some blame themselves. One man says, "We built her strong, but she wasn't made to dodge ice at 22 knots. Another shrugs and says, "She was made to impress, not to survive." One of them, an older fellow with a voice like gravel, tells you something that sticks. "We build these things," he says, And then the world pretends they were never supposed to break. He raises his glass. Everything breaks, even the pretty things. And maybe that's what hurts the most. That Titanic wasn't just a tragedy. It was a betrayal of promise. People got on board expecting to arrive, not because they were arrogant or rich or foolish, but because the world had told them they would. The brochures said modern engineering had made the sea safe. The papers said this ship was the peak of human achievement. They believed it. Why wouldn't they? But the people left behind know better now. They've learned that no amount of press clippings or good intentions can keep the ocean from swallowing what it wants. They've learned that sometimes lifeboats aren't enough, that the class you paid for can decide whether you live or die. They've learned that the world doesn't always remember the ones who mattered most, like the Syrian man whose entire family was lost and whose name is spelled 3 different ways in 3 different records, or the Chinese survivors who were deported as soon as they reached New York and erased from public memory for decades, or the Irish teenagers who were lumped together in lists as unaccompanied minors and buried without names. You begin to understand that the disaster didn't end when the Titanic sank. It spread outward, quietly, invisibly, like ripples in a pond. It touched people who never saw the ship, never set foot on a deck. And some of them, like Liam's mother, have carried that loss like a second spine. Rigid, permanent, unspoken. You leave the cottage with a loaf of soda bread she insisted you take. You walk back to the village inn where your room is waiting, and you light a candle by the window before bed. Not for show, not for ceremony, just because she did, and because somehow it feels like the right thing to do. You find yourself in Halifax, Nova Scotia now, a place you didn't expect to come to, but the story pulls you here. The air is sharp, salt-heavy, with a chill that creeps in even through your coat collar. It's a port city, rough around the edges, and strangely quiet for all the work it's doing. You're here because Halifax was the city that caught the dead. While the world talked about lifeboats and heroes and engineering failures, Halifax pulled hundreds of frozen bodies out of the sea. It was the clean-up crew for the Atlantic's darkest moment. You walk the pier where the cable ship Mackay Bennett once docked. It left port just days after the sinking, outfitted not for rescue, but for recovery. Coal, embalming fluid, coffins, ice, canvas bags. You feel the shift immediately. This part of the story has no glamour, no orchestras, no myths, just death and duty. The Mackay Bennett and 2 other ships, Minya and Montmagny, were dispatched to find what was left of Titanic's wake. What they found was more than anyone could handle. Bodies. So many bodies. You walk into the Maritime Museum and there's a display. Black boots, a child's white slipper, a pocket watch stuck at 2:20 a.m. The moment Titanic vanished beneath the waves. Each object is both small and colossal. You stare at the watch for a long time. It isn't just a relic. It's proof. It's a fragment of someone's last moment. The recovery crews wrote everything down, carefully, each body tagged and numbered, wallets catalogued, jewellery documented, bodies embalmed if possible, buried at sea if not. The wealthiest were preserved and returned to their families. The poorer, unidentified, were buried here in Halifax, 150 in total. You visit them, one by one. At Fairview Lawn Cemetery, the stones are lined in soft curves like the hull of a ship. Most are simple grey granite, etched with the date, April 15th, 1912. Some have names, many don't, just numbers. You kneel beside grave number 239, marked Unknown Child. He was buried with full honours, his tiny coffin carried by sailors and attended by mourners who never knew his name. For decades, people visited this grave and left flowers, toys, even handwritten letters. Then science got involved. In the early 2000s, DNA testing identified him as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old boy from England. His entire family perished with him. It was supposed to be a comfort, a name to anchor the grief. But for some, it made things harder. The unknown had belonged to everyone. Now, he belonged to history. You find yourself caught between 2 reactions: gratitude for the truth, and grief for the loss of mystery. There's something sacred about the unknown, but also something cruel. Further down the row, you see a headstone that simply reads, J. Dawson. You sigh. Yes, that one. Jack Dawson. The name made famous by a movie that hadn't even been imagined when this man was buried. But people leave flowers here still, decades later. Love letters, heartfelt apologies. They think he's fictional. He wasn't. The real Joseph Dawson was a coal trimmer from Dublin. He worked down in the boiler rooms, and he, like so many others, died doing a job no one romanticizes. The city of Halifax treated these dead with a reverence that feels rare. Volunteers lined the routes of the hearses, businesses closed for funerals, school children were brought to services to understand the scale of it. And yet, for all this honour, there's still a blunt bureaucratic weight to it. Unclaimed, unknown, remains disposed at sea. The sea, you realise, kept more than it gave back, and that's where things get more complicated. Not every body was treated equally. First-class passengers were more likely to be embalmed, more likely to be returned home. Poorer victims were often buried at sea. The reasoning was logistical, limited space, limited supplies. But the effect? A posthumous class divide. Even in death, Titanic's hierarchy held fast. You meet a local historian who tells you how undertakers worked around the clock, how stores donated suits to dress the dead, how hotels opened their ballrooms to store bodies when the morgue overflowed. He says Halifax has never fully recovered. We didn't lose anyone on Titanic, he tells you, but we carried the weight of it anyway. He shows you a ledger, the list of personal effects found on the bodies. A gold ring, a stuffed bear, a sealed letter, a lady's boot with a button missing. You try not to imagine the people who once wore these things. But of course, you do. You always do. Then he shares something strange. Among the dead was a man whose pockets were filled with lemon drops. That's all. Dozens of them, still wrapped. No one knows why. A comfort item? A gift? A habit? It's a small, odd detail that sticks with you more than any number or name. You think about it for the rest of the day. Lemon drops. You visit the dock again that evening. The wind off the Atlantic is fierce now, slicing through your coat. You stare out into the blackening horizon and imagine the recovery ships returning. Their decks lined with canvas-wrapped shapes, their flags at half-mast. No headlines, no crowds, just cold and silence and duty. This is the part no one wanted to talk about. The morgues, the embalming, the sorting of death. But Halifax did it, quietly, carefully, with a strange, sturdy kind of grace. It occurs to you standing there by the water that the people who pulled the dead from the sea are also survivors, not of the sinking, but of the aftermath. They didn't ride the Titanic, but they bore her weight, and maybe that's a harder burden to carry. You're back in England now, stepping through the heavy front doors of the White Star Line's Liverpool headquarters, a building with a sombre elegance, all grey stone and high windows that let in just enough light to make the interior feel colder than it should. You're not here as a passenger this time, not as a survivor. You're here to watch the clean-up, the real clean-up, not of bodies or lifeboats, but of names, reputations and ledgers. Inside, the White Star staff move like people trapped in a dream where they can't quite run fast enough. Phones ring, secretaries, shuffle papers. Executives stare at stacks of correspondence with a weariness that no amount of brass polish can hide. The Titanic has become more than a ship now. She's a public relations disaster, a legal nightmare, a fire that no one can put out, but everyone is trying. You're shown into a small meeting room where a junior clerk explains what's happening. We're coordinating statements, he says, responding to letters, preparing for the lawsuits. He says it like it's all very tedious, like the worst part of this is the paperwork. You glance down at a form on the desk. It reads, "Claim for loss of property aboard RMS Titanic." Under it, there are blank lines for name, address, and a brief description of what was lost. There's no line for husband, no checkbox for child, just an open space where people are expected to assign a dollar value to the irreplaceable. You learn that the company is refunding fares, quietly and without ceremony. They've begun sending out checks to the families of the deceased, modest amounts, precise, emotionless sums. There's no handwritten apology, no personal touch, just business. You get the sense that White Star is terrified, not just of the lawsuits, though there will be plenty, but of the court of public opinion. The scandal of the lifeboats, the whispers that is may push the captain to go faster, the the fact that their crown jewel now lies at the bottom of the sea, taking careers and reputations down with it. You ask to see the letters. They show you a stack. Hundreds of envelopes, most of them handwritten, some smeared with tears. They come from everywhere. From families in America asking when their son's body will be returned. From Irish mothers who never received a ticket stub, let alone a death certificate. From passengers demanding compensation. From passengers thanking White Star for doing the best they could. That one stings the most. You read it twice. Upstairs, the mood is more clinical. A conference room filled with charts and memos, damage control plans, insurance documents, internal memos advising staff on how to respond to questions. There's a new protocol for speaking to the press. No interviews, no opinions, just scripted statements. One of them reads, "The tragedy of the Titanic is deeply felt by all at White Star. We are fully cooperating with the inquiries and remain committed to the highest standards of maritime service." You hear it in your head as it's read aloud, and it sounds like someone carving initials into a coffin lid. You're introduced to a mid-level executive who's been tasked with external relations. He has that look, well-dressed, too tired, trying to pretend none of this is personal. He offers you a weak smile and says, "We're rebuilding trust." You nod, unsure what to say. He goes on as if you asked, "There was talk of launching a new ship in the Olympic class, something to show that we still believe in the future. But..." He trails off. You both know the public isn't ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Then he says something you weren't expecting. "You know, we had a policy of not naming ships after living people, but for the Titanic, we made an exception." You raise an eyebrow. He leans back. "There was a political push to name her after the Titanic race, the mythic people of strength. It sounded noble, epic, fitting for a ship that large." He pauses. "Maybe we should have stuck with tradition." You don't say anything, but you're thinking it. Or maybe they should have focused less on legends and more on lifeboats. Later, you're taken to a dusty storage room where the personal belongings of some of the deceased have been shipped. Suitcases, handbags, steamer trunks. Most have never been claimed. You run your fingers over the initials stamped on the side of one, MWL. There's no way to know who that was. The label's torn, the paper inside faded. Somewhere in the world, someone might still be waiting for that bag. Or maybe they gave up long ago. You ask about the crew, the ones who survived. Are they being compensated? The clerk gives a non-committal shrug. "We're reviewing those cases," he says. "Some were offered positions on other ships. Some refused." He lowers his voice. "A few haven't worked since." That doesn't surprise you. You know what it's like to close your eyes and hear water, screaming, steel tearing apart. Outside the building there's a growing crowd. Protesters, mourners, journalists. Some carry signs. No more unsinkable lies. Justice for steerage. Others hold photographs of loved ones, the ones who didn't make it home. One woman stands silently with a pair of men's shoes held in her hands. That image will stay with you forever. She doesn't shout. She just stands there, letting the shoes speak for themselves. The press is hungry for scandal. They camp outside White Star's doors looking for cracks in the facade. A whispered comment, a leaked memo. You hear one reporter mutter, "If this were any other industry, the company would be finished." But White Star isn't any other company. It's part of the system, entwined with governments, contracts, investors. It won't go down with the ship. Not this time. The next morning, the company releases a public statement of regret, but it stops just short of an apology. It's careful, sterile, engineered to protect. Some papers praise it, others tear it to pieces, but it doesn't matter really. The damage is done. The name Titanic, once a symbol of triumph, now conjures up horror and shame, and it's dragging the White Star Line down with it. Before you leave, you pass by a meeting room where company officials are drafting press material for their next voyage. Yes, there will be another. Not of Titanic, of course, but the world still needs ships, and White Star still needs to survive. You step out onto the street, past the signs and the reporters, past the names scribbled in chalk on the pavement. You hear a young boy ask his mother what White Star means. She answers, "It's the company that built the ship that sank. That's it. That's the new brand. That's the legacy they're trying to manage. You walk away wondering how long it'll take before the world forgets the names behind the paperwork, and whether they ever really knew them in the first place. The courtroom smells like old wood, paper dust, and freshly printed disappointment. You're not on trial, not exactly, but it sure feels like someone is. You sit in the gallery as the first of what will become dozens of lawsuits is called to order. The Titanic didn't just leave behind debris and memories, it left behind claims, and lots of them. You glance at the docket and feel a wave of nausea. 145 separate legal actions, all jockeying for space, attention, and maybe a little justice if such a thing still exists. The cases are filed in New York under American maritime law, even though the Titanic flew a British flag. It's one of those weird international jurisdictional knots no one wants to untangle, so they let the lawyers hack at it with golden scissors. The court is supposed to determine what White Star owes the families of the dead, the survivors, and those who lost their property. But the math is cruel. It's one of the coldest things you'll ever witness. The price tag of a life, totaled up by men in robes and suits. Some are here seeking compensation for lost relatives. Others are trying to reclaim money for property that sank. Trunks of clothes, jewellery, cash, rare books, even one man's antique collection of musical instruments. You overhear one case involving a parrot. Yes, someone brought a parrot aboard. It did not survive. The owner wants damages. The numbers are staggering. Millions in claims. But White Star and its insurers push back hard. Their defence is anchored to a legal technicality, something called the Limited Liability Act of 1851, which caps a shipowner's financial responsibility to the value of the vessel and the freight that was saved. And since the Titanic lies at the bottom of the sea and the freight is essentially nothing, White Star claims they owe a mere $91,000. That's it. $91,000 for 1/500 lost lives, hundreds of wrecked families, and the most infamous shipwreck in modern memory. The courtroom erupts. One lawyer calls it a travesty cloaked in legality. Another mutters that a single first-class ticket costs more than that. You can't argue with the numbers. They're like gravestones, hard, unyielding, and too numerous to ignore. You watch as a mother takes the stand. She lost her husband and 2 sons. She doesn't ask for sympathy. She asks for enough to bury them properly. Her voice doesn't shake. She reads from a letter her husband mailed from Queenstown. You feel something tear inside you as she folds it back into her purse and steps down. Later, a man in a neatly tailored suit testifies about a diamond necklace he lost in a first-class cabin. He calls it an heirloom of significant sentiment. He wants $4,000. The judge doesn't blink. There's something hollow about the entire exchange, grief and luxury jostling elbows on the same bench. In the hallways, lawyers speak in clipped tones. You catch phrases like settlement class, negligent standard, and culpability without direct fault. The language is designed to sound smart to keep emotion out of the room, but you know better. You've seen the cost already, in frozen limbs, empty cots, and quiet dinners where no one speaks anymore. The quirks in the process pile up. Some claims come from passengers who survived but lost all they owned. Others are more creative. One man insists the trauma of nearly drowning has ruined his appetite, and he can no longer enjoy roast beef. Another files a claim for emotional disfigurement. You don't roll your eyes, you get it. Everyone's trying to name their pain, and the only vocabulary the court recognises is financial. The most debated case involves J. Bruce Ismay himself. Several plaintiffs argue that his presence in a lifeboat contributed to the loss of morale and created panic. It's an inventive argument, stretching the idea of damages into something more abstract. The court debates whether public figures should be held to a higher standard. Someone references the captain goes down with the ship code. But Ismay wasn't the captain. He was the chairman, a businessman. Legally, not required to die. You leave the courtroom that day with a headache and the slow-burning realization that justice doesn't always feel like justice. Sometimes it's a ledger balanced and signed off. Sometimes it's a figure scribbled in pencil on a sheet of paper. 150. Loss of spousal companionship. You walk past the wall of case files, each one a thin manila folder with a name typed neatly at the top. You imagine those folders stacked on the ocean floor, soggy and unread. Outside, in the waiting area, survivors sit with their attorneys. One man paces, another fiddles with a pin on his lapel. a tiny Titanic charm someone gave him, half in mockery, half in pity. A young woman stares at the floor like she's trying to see straight through it. You sit beside her. She lost her fiancé. She filed a claim. She doesn't expect to see a cent. "You doing okay?" you ask. She shrugs. "I just wanted someone to say what he was worth." The answer eventually is not much. In the end, the lawsuits are settled as a group. A single lump sum, $664,000, is paid out by White Star's insurers, divided among the claimants in proportions the court determines. The average award per death is less than $1,000. Some get more, some get almost nothing. Property claims are settled faster. Grief takes longer. No criminal charges are ever brought. No one is jailed. No careers are ended in disgrace. The inquiries blame the ice. The courts blame circumstance. The lawyers blame the paperwork. And the survivors, they just blame the silence that came after. You keep a copy of the settlement notice in your bag. It's thin. A few pages. It reads like a receipt for something unspeakable. And at the bottom, in small print, a line that sticks with you. "This payment shall not be considered an admission of guilt." You fold it back up and tuck it away. Because you already know the truth, and you don't need a court to confirm it. You get the invitation in a letter, neatly folded, heavy cream paper embossed in gold ink. It's not addressed to survivor or passenger or witness. It's addressed to you by name, as if the person sending it wants to remind you you're still a person, not just an event. You're invited to a gathering in London, hosted by a small committee of women who survived Titanic. You pause when you read the names. So many are familiar now, not because of the papers or the courts, but because they lingered in your memory. The quiet ones, the brave ones, the ones who didn't scream but simply endured. The event is held in a garden behind a stately manor, walled off from the noise of the street. Ivy curls up stone pillars. The roses are in bloom. It's as far from the cold Atlantic as you can imagine, and for a moment that feels like betrayal. But then you realise it's also resistance, refusing to let the tragedy consume every part of life. Margaret Brown is there, of course. The unsinkable Molly Brown, though she rolls her eyes at the nickname. She's taller than you remember, or maybe just more certain of herself. She's organising efforts now, raising money for widows, for steerage families, for anyone who made it off the ship with only the clothes on their back. She hands you a cup of tea like she's known you forever. She tells stories easily, with a drawl and a smirk. But when she talks about that night, about arguing with the crew in her lifeboat to turn back, about the silence when they didn't, you see the steel behind her smile. "They say I'm brave," she says, "but I was just stubborn. Brave would have been pulling more people out of the water." She doesn't mean it to wound, but it lands anyway. Around the garden, women are talking in small groups. Their voices are soft, their dresses elegant, but there's a current beneath it all. Loss, resilience, and something harder to name. A woman named Edith Russell, who was travelling with a musical pig, a gift, she explains, not a pet, tells how she refused to get in a lifeboat without it. She's still got the thing. Wind it up, and it plays a cheerful little tune. She brought it as a sort of joke. The sound makes some of the women laugh. Others go quiet. The contrast is too sharp. You notice how they sit, straight-backed, composed, gloved fingers folded, over skirts. Society women, most of them. But underneath all that polish is a sort of defiance. They've been told how lucky they are. They've heard the praise, the whispers of divine intervention, the admiration from strangers. But luck doesn't explain what it's like to watch your husband vanish beneath black water, or to tell your children their father isn't coming back. These women aren't lucky. They're just unfinished. Survivors who didn't ask to be. They talk about the other women who didn't make it. Ida Strauss, who chose to stay on the ship with her husband, Isidore, rather than leave him behind. "We have lived together for many years," she reportedly said. "Where you go, I go." Her story's been printed in the papers so many times it sounds like a legend now. But the women here remember her as she was, a kind, practical woman who wore sensible shoes and never liked the cold. They talk about Miss Jessie Leach, the young governess who refused to leave her charge behind. About Nora Keane, a stewardess who stayed below decks helping passengers find life jackets until the very last minute. About the Countess of Roths, who rowed her lifeboat for hours and comforted a sailor sobbing in the dark. These women aren't statues or poems. They were real, brave, angry, determined, and mostly forgotten. One of them, a widow named Eleanor, speaks up during a lull. Her voice shakes. "They want us to be tragic," she says. "They want us to cry on cue and then fade into memory. But that's not who we are." Everyone nods. Someone murmurs, "Yes, exactly." You think about the headlines from a few weeks ago. Brave women weep at memorial, as if tears are the only acceptable expression, as if grief should be graceful. You overhear a few planning something big, an official Titanic Women's Relief Committee. They're drafting proposals, setting up scholarships for children who lost parents, offering stipends to stewardesses left without income. They're organising not because they have to, but because they refuse to sit still. "Men build ships," one of them says, "but we rebuild after they sink." And then there's the silence, the shared sacred quiet that descends when someone mentions a child. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a name. A girl who clung to her mother on the lifeboat. A boy who asked if his father would be swimming behind them. A toddler in 3rd class who never made it above deck. The women don't share these stories for sympathy. They share them because someone has to remember. After a while, the conversation drifts to what comes next. Not just for them, but for the world. Some talk about travel again, about boarding ships in the future. Most say no, a few say maybe. They'll wait until ships carry enough boats for everyone, until captains listen to iceberg warnings, until safety is more than just a brochure. Someone asks what they'll tell their grandchildren one day. You hear the answers in pieces. That people died needlessly. That some men were brave. That nothing is unsinkable. Before the gathering ends, they pass around a notebook, asking everyone to write something. Just a sentence or two. A memory, a name, a feeling. You flip through it slowly. I remember the sound of music over water. He gave up his seat for me. I still wake up thinking I'm in that lifeboat. When it's your turn, you pause. Then you write, "We survived, but don't you dare call that lucky." That night, as the guests say their goodbyes, Margaret Brown stands near the gate, giving each woman a hug or a word of encouragement. When it's your turn, she clasps your hand. "We won't be forgotten," she says. "Not if we keep telling the truth." You nod. Because that's all you have now. The truth, and the women who carry it. You don't know how it happens exactly, but one morning you wake up and Titanic has become entertainment. A play opens in London, small stage, modest audience. You're curious, maybe against your better judgment, and find yourself buying a ticket. The theatre smells like velvet and stale cigarettes, and you settle into your seat as the house lights dim. The curtain rises to a painted backdrop of stars and a papier-mâché iceberg. There's a woman in a beaded dress sobbing dramatically. A man in a captain's hat with a plastic beard delivering noble lines. At some point, someone actually shouts, "Save yourselves!" like they're in a melodrama. You sit there, stiff as a figurehead, as the audience gasps and sighs in all the wrong places. They cry at the crescendo of a violin solo. They cheer when the survivors climb into lifeboats. You want to stand up and scream, "That's not how it happened." But instead, you watch until the end. Until the lights come back up and people file out into the night air, dabbing their eyes and murmuring about how moving it all was. You walk home under a theatre marquee that reads, "Titanic, a tragedy in 3 acts." You want to laugh, you want to tear it down, but you don't, because you know the truth, and they don't. Still, it gets worse. A few months later, you see a poster for a silent film, Saved from the Titanic. You nearly walk past it, assuming it's a joke. But there's her name in block letters, Dorothy Gibson, a survivor, an actual passenger. And not only is she in the film, she stars as herself. She reenacts her own escape from the sinking ship, wearing the exact same dress she wore that night. That stops you cold. You buy a ticket. The theatre is packed, all eyes on the flickering screen. It opens with Dorothy boarding the ship, waving to her imaginary family. You watch, jaw clenched, as grainy footage shows her escaping in a lifeboat, overacted terror on her face. The iceberg is a lumpy set piece, and the other passengers look like they're sleepwalking through a dream someone else wrote. At the climax, Dorothy faints in the arms of a brave officer, and the audience bursts into applause. The lights come up and you sit there stunned. The man beside you turns and says, "Beautiful, wasn't it? So brave of her to relive it." You nod because what else can you do? But inside your stomach twists. You don't blame Dorothy. Not really. Maybe this was how she coped. Maybe it made her feel like she'd reclaimed something. But it feels wrong. The paint is still wet on the memory. The water hasn't even finished swallowing the wreck, and already it's a spectacle. You read that some survivors went to see the film and left in tears. Others refused to watch at all. There are whispers that Dorothy had a breakdown not long after. You wonder if she stood in front of the camera pretending to drown and realised she hadn't really stopped. It isn't just theatre and film either. The newspapers still can't get enough. You see serialised fiction in the Sunday pages, love afloat, a Titanic romance. A ridiculous story about a rich heiress and a poor sailor who fall in love just before the iceberg hits. The final scene has them kissing in a lifeboat while violins swell around them. The author admits to having never set foot on a ship. You stop reading newspapers after that, but the public doesn't. They eat it up. The disaster has entered the bloodstream of pop culture. Sheet music hits the shelves. Ballads with titles like Wreck of the Titanic and My Sweetheart Went Down with the Ship. Some are slow and mournful, others are almost jaunty like drinking songs. You hear one in a pub and nearly choke on your ale. The strange thing is, people aren't being cruel, they think they're honouring the dead. They're holding benefit concerts and dramatic readings. Stage managers donate ticket sales to Titanic relief funds. Artists paint tragic portraits of lovers lost at sea. The sadness is real, but it's become stylised. Almost beautiful. Like they've wrapped the whole thing in silk and roses so they don't have to look directly at the horror. You run into another survivor at one of these events. She's polite, composed, dressed in black silk. When you ask her how she feels about all of it, the plays, the movies, the songs, she just shrugs. People need their versions, she says. I have mine. They can have theirs. You want to believe that. You want to let it go. But you remember her face on the Carpathia, pale and hollowed out, staring at the sea. That's not something you recreate under stage lights. Months later, you hear about a travelling carnival with a Titanic experience. Visitors walk through a mock-up of the ship's deck, then climb into a fake lifeboat. Actors dressed as officers shout, "Women and children first!" while someone turns off the lights and splashes water in your face. People laugh. Some scream for fun. There's a souvenir stand selling Titanic tea towels and candy moulds shaped like icebergs. That's when you know for sure the story no longer belongs to you, or to anyone who was there. It's become a myth, a brand, a costume people can try on for a few hours before they go home to dry socks and warm beds. But something strange happens too. Amid all the cheap melodrama and manufactured tragedy, something honest slips through. A child writes a poem for school that makes you cry. A stranger donates a month's wages to a fund for orphaned children. A choir sings a hymn at a memorial service. And for a moment, it's like you're back on the lifeboat, watching the sun rise over the wreckage. Not everyone gets it wrong. Not everyone turns it into theatre. Some remember. Some still light candles, still speak the names, still ask the hard questions no play will ever answer. You walk past a shop window one day and see a doll dressed in Titanic fashion, complete with miniature life jacket and boarding pass. You stare for a long time, then keep walking. Because you know the real tragedy isn't being forgotten. It's being remembered wrong. You're on a dock again, but this time it's not for rescue, not for court, not for memorial. You're here to board another ship. Not Titanic, of course. That name is retired now, folded away like a mourning ribbon. This ship is modest by comparison, smaller, quieter, and stripped of illusion. It doesn't pretend to be unsinkable. No one claps when you step aboard. No orchestra plays. The only sound is the steady creak of ropes and the groan of the hull as it braces against the tide. You're not here to cross the ocean. You're here to understand how so many climbed back aboard so soon after that night. Because that's what you've been hearing lately. Rumours, whispered names, crew members from Titanic who, barely a week or two after the Carpathia docked in New York, signed up for new ships, steamers, cargo haulers, mailboats, passenger liners. They returned to sea like it was nothing, like they hadn't just watched a floating palace break in two and swallow people alive. You want to know why. So you start with one of them, a man named Joe, fireman. Big hands, bigger heart, soot still clinging to the creases in his fingernails. You find him hauling coal aboard this newer vessel, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He's friendly, but guarded. You tell him you were there too. He looks you up and down, then nods once. That's enough. You're in the club now. Not a club anyone wants to join, but a club nonetheless. You ask him why he came back. He shrugs. What else was I going to do, he says. The sea's all I know. Besides, gotta eat. You press a little. Don't people ask? Don't they treat him differently? He snorts. They think I'm cursed, he says, but they still need the coal shoveled, don't they? He tells you others came back too. A surprising number, really. Stewards, engineers, galley boys. Some found new ships within days. Some were even hired back by White Star. You think about that. The same company, the same uniforms, the same cold metal corridors. One man reportedly reboarded Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, just 10 days after the sinking. You can't decide if it's bravery, necessity, or madness. Joe calls it survival. You fall off a horse, you get back on, he says, even if the last horse threw you into the bloody ocean. But it's not just financial. Some of them talk about it like it's medicine. The rhythm of the job, the predictability, wake up, shovel coal, eat, sleep, repeat. No time to think, no time to remember. The sea becomes a kind of amnesia. Salt water washing over trauma. It's loud, physical, exhausting. There's no room in your head for ghosts when you're dodging burning steam pipes. Others, though, they tried and couldn't do it. You hear about one steward who boarded a new ship, made it 2 days, then disembarked at the first port, shaking and silent. Another tried to row during a routine drill and had a breakdown when the oars hit the water. The splash triggered something. He never went back to sea again. You hear about a young cabin boy, barely 17, who lied about his age to work aboard Titanic. He survived, made it onto a lifeboat, and later tried to join the Navy. They turned him away when they found out who he was. Too much trauma, the officer said. You'll panic under pressure. The irony is so thick it makes you dizzy. The ship you're on now rocks gently beneath your feet, and for a moment you imagine the panic rising again. That unmistakable tilt, the way your brain refuses to accept it at first, the distant sound of something tearing. Then Joe claps you on the back. You all right? You nod. Just remembering. He hands you a mug of tea. Don't let it eat you, he says. You got out. That's what counts. You ask if he dreams about it. Course I do, he replies. Ship's going down. I'm still down below. No way out. Always wakes me before it ends. He sips. But the dreams don't scare me anymore. The silence after does. You hear that a stewardess from Titanic now works the dining room on another liner. She smiles at guests, pours tea, straightens forks. People recognize her sometimes. Quietly, nervously. A few avoid her. Some tip her extra. She never brings it up. But once a young lady asks her softly what it was like. The stewardess leans in and says, "It was like watching your whole world close its eyes." Then she walks away. There are others too. Musicians who didn't sail that night but worked with those who did. Cooks who trained Titanic's chefs. Engineers who designed her boilers. All of them haunted in some way, trying to keep moving. Trying not to sink under the weight of what could have been. You flip through a shipping registry and start recognizing names. A trimmer on the Carpathia. A wireless operator from Titanic now sending messages aboard a freighter bound for Brazil. They keep going. Like soldiers after war. Because what else can they do? But there's a darker side too. You hear whispers about a man who drinks too much, starts fights in pubs if anyone mentions lifeboats. Another was found sleeping on the beach, wrapped in an old blanket, mumbling numbers that turned out to be lifeboat capacities. You hear about suicides, about families that won't speak of the sinking, about survivors who pretend they were never aboard at all. Joe says he understands those men. It doesn't leave you, he says. You just learn where to put it. Like a coal bin in your head. You shovel the memories in, slam the lid, and pray the damn thing doesn't burst. You spend 3 days aboard that new ship, listening, watching, learning. Every clang of metal brings a flicker of memory. Every wave reminds you of the night sky over the lifeboats. But you also feel something unexpected. Admiration. Not for the ship, for the people, for those who came back. They didn't come back because they were fearless. They came back because they had to. Because food doesn't appear on its own. Because grief doesn't pay rent. Because healing isn't always gentle. You disembark at the next port, boots crunching against gravel, and look back at the ship. It doesn't feel like a coffin. Not this one. It feels like a second chance. A lifeboat in its own way. And the people aboard? They're not foolish. They're not cursed. They're not symbols. They're just people. Still floating. You're sitting in a library in Southampton, thumbing through a stack of clippings and inquiry transcripts, when you notice how many pages are missing. Not literally, though a few look suspiciously thin, but in the way stories are told. There's one man whose name pops up again and again, but always in vague, half-finished sentences. Captain Edward Smith. The last man on the bridge, the seasoned mariner, the dignified face of duty. Everyone has a version of him, but no one seems to know who he really was when the water finally rose. You decide to find out. What you know already is the headline stuff. Smith was the most senior captain in the White Star Line, a decorated veteran of transatlantic crossings. Tall, silver-haired, with a beard that made him look like Father Christmas if Father Christmas had an affinity for epaulets and maritime law. He was trusted, admired, the sort of man passengers like to see strolling the decks. Solid, respectable, always calm. They said he gave off the impression that nothing could possibly go wrong under his command, which in hindsight is a bit like complimenting the Titanic's tight turning radius. He was meant to retire after Titanic's maiden voyage. A final crossing, then home to a quiet life in Staffordshire with his wife and daughter. That part always catches in your throat. Just one more journey. In the days after the sinking, the world couldn't decide what to do with him. Hero, coward, martyr, villain. His body was never found, so he became something stranger than a man. He became a symbol, a floating question mark with a captain's cap. Some survivors insist he went down like a legend, standing on the bridge, saluting as the bow dipped beneath the surface. One steward claimed he saw Smith helping women into lifeboats until the last possible second, refusing a seat for himself. Another passenger said he shouted, "Be British, boys," before the sea swallowed him. That phrase made it into every newspaper within a week. You've read it 100 times now, printed under oil portraits and over stilted poems. It sounds good, stirring, patriotic, too good. Because then you read the other accounts, the ones that didn't make the front page. A fireman who said he saw the captain jump into the water. A steward who swore Smith was pacing the deck in silence, dazed and speechless. One crewman claims he saw the captain shoot himself with a pistol just before the ship went under. That's when you realise nobody really knows what happened to Captain Edward Smith, and maybe that's the point. He became a blank canvas onto which people projected what they needed. Honour, failure, dignity, defiance. The perfect man to become a myth. Dead men can't defend themselves after all. And Smith's absence created a vacuum that everyone rushed to fill. You dig deeper. You learn that Smith wasn't particularly fast with a ship. In fact, he had a reputation for being too relaxed. He once brought another White Star liner, the Olympic, into dock at such an odd angle that it caused a collision with a Royal Navy vessel. That incident was quietly smoothed over, no blame officially placed, but it stuck in some people's memories. Others whispered that he was too comfortable around icebergs, that he trusted technology too much, that he relied on younger officers to mind the details while he played host in the first-class lounge. But there's no record of arrogance, no proof that he bragged about Titanic's speed or told passengers they'd make an early arrival. Those are embellishments, shiny bits of fiction sewn into the real man's coat. What you find instead is a man nearing the end of his career, doing what he always did, trusting the ship, the crew, the process. Until the process failed. You meet a former officer who served with Smith years before. He doesn't want to be quoted, but he offers this. The captain didn't fear the sea. He respected it, but he didn't fear it. Maybe that was the mistake. You keep coming back to that word, mistake, because that's what Smith made, if he made anything at all. He underestimated. He believed the ship could take more than it could. He delayed lowering lifeboats. He didn't reduce speed despite the ice warnings. But he wasn't malicious, just human. Just a man raised in an age that worshipped steel and steam and the illusion of control. And there's something else too. Something nobody talks about enough. Smith didn't train for this. No one had. There were no standard procedures for a ship of that size sinking in the middle of the Atlantic. No playbook for how to handle 2,000 terrified souls and 20 lifeboats. You can say he failed, and maybe he did. But he failed in a system that hadn't prepared him for what was coming. A captain with 40 years of experience, undone by a floating mountain and a flawed design. There's a letter in the archives written by Smith 2 weeks before Titanic sailed. It's short, formal. He thanks an old friend for a retirement gift, says he's looking forward to some peace and quiet. He ends it with, "This ship will be the crowning achievement of my career." Quite the send-off, eh? That sentence rattles around in your head for days. You visit his hometown later, a sleepy little place with cobbled streets and shops that close too early. There's a statue of him in the park, clean-shaven and proud, wearing his captain's coat. Beneath it, a plaque reads, Captain Edward J. Smith, commander of the Titanic, died at sea, a true British hero. You stand there a long time. You want to say something to him, though you're not sure what. Maybe, I hope it was quick. Or, I'm sorry they made you a myth before they knew the facts. Or maybe just, I don't know what you did in those final minutes. But I hope, whatever it was, it felt like the right thing. Because in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. You don't notice it right away. Not in the chaos, not in the headlines, not even during the inquiries, but the survivors are disappearing. Not physically, though some have already died of illness or quiet despair. What you begin to notice is subtler. The way they stop talking, the way their eyes change when someone brings up the ship, the way they drift away from conversation, like lifeboats pulling off into silence. You start to understand that surviving isn't an endpoint. It's not a medal you wear or a headline you clip. It's a state of being, an unsettled one. They call it survivor's guilt, though no one has the words for it yet, not really. There's no clinical term, no pamphlet, no therapy group. It's just there, like a second skin. You feel it settle over your shoulders every time someone calls you lucky. Every time a stranger says, "At least you made it." You want to scream, "You think I made it?" You want to hold up a mirror and say, "Does this look like survival?" You visit a man named George, third-class passenger, 32 years old, father of 3. You shared a lifeboat with him. He wrote you once after the Carpathia docked, said, "Can't sleep. Not because of what happened, but because of what I did." Now you're sitting in his tiny flat in East London, watching as he smokes cigarette after cigarette, hands trembling even though the rest of him is perfectly still. You ask him what he meant in the letter. He exhales and doesn't answer for a while. Eventually he says, "I pushed someone." The words land like a broken oar. Not hard, just shoved them aside. There was an opening. I took it. He rubs his face. I don't even know if they fell back. Don't know if they made it. But I think about it every night. You tell him that anyone would have done the same. That fear does strange things. He shrugs. Maybe, but it doesn't feel brave. It feels like theft. He's not alone. You hear stories from others who don't go outside anymore, who won't board a train, who can't stand the sound of running water. One woman refuses to eat anything that was served on Titanic's menu. No lamb, no consommé, no white bread. Tastes like ghosts, she says. Another man, a stoker, tried to return to the sea, made it to the dock, then turned and ran, leaving his bag behind. He now works in a basement sorting crates, keeps the lights on all the time, hasn't taken a bath since April, only showers, says it's the silence of bathwater that does it. You're invited to a small gathering in a community hall, just 10 survivors, sitting in a circle of mismatched chairs. No press, no speeches, just a place to speak without performance. You listen as they talk, slowly at first, then faster, words tumbling out like floodwater. One woman says she lied to get into a lifeboat, said she had a baby when she didn't. Another says he jumped into the water and pulled himself up the side of a boat, knowing full well they were trying to row away. No one blames them. That's the unspoken agreement in the room. No judgment, just honesty. A steward who was lauded as a hero at the Senate inquiry now drinks himself numb every night. He tells you he was only trying to avoid orders, found himself by a lifeboat, and when it lowered, he stayed in it. That's it. No heroism, just timing. But the papers wanted a narrative, so they gave him one, called him courageous, sent him letters, children drew pictures of him. "It's like I'm impersonating someone else," he mutters. Then there's the woman who never speaks. She just holds a small locket in her hands and stares at the floor. You recognise her from the Carpathia. Her husband died, So did her sister. She was supposed to go down with them, but a crewman physically lifted her into a lifeboat against her will. She hasn't spoken since, not a word. They say she writes in notebooks, but no one knows what's inside. Some survivors lean hard into religion. They say God spared them, that there was a reason, that he chose them. But not everyone finds comfort in that. A school teacher from Ireland says, if God chose me, he also chose to drown my wife and child. No one has an answer for that, so the room just goes quiet. You remember that feeling, the strange dissonance of being celebrated while others are being buried. People call you blessed, they call you strong, but you feel like neither. You feel like a house that's still standing while every building around you is burned to ash, and every morning you open the door expecting the smoke to come for you next. You start to notice something else too. Survivors splitting into categories. There are the ones who talk, who write books, give lectures, lean into the attention. They're praised mostly, sometimes mocked. And then there are the others, the quiet ones, the ones who vanish back into their lives and never say another word. People call them mysterious, but you know better. They're just trying to survive all over again, this time in a world that doesn't understand them. You read a letter from a man who lost his brother. He writes, I envy him. I don't know why, but I do. Another writes, I wish I hadn't gotten on that boat, but more than that, I wish I hadn't gotten off. You keep these letters. You don't know why. Maybe because they say the things no one else is allowed to. Maybe because they're proof that survival isn't a victory march, it's a quiet war. At a train station one afternoon, a man recognizes you. He asks if you were one of the Titanic people. You nod. He smiles as if you've just confirmed you once met the Queen. He says, well, aren't you lucky? You thank him. You nod. You keep walking. And later, when you're alone, you say the thing you didn't say to him. Luck has nothing to do with it. I'm just the one who made it to the surface. That night you dream of lifeboats again. Except this time, you're not in one. You're the voice still calling from the water. You hadn't planned to visit the United States again, but something keeps pulling you west. Maybe it's the unanswered questions. Maybe it's the people who disembarked from the Carpathia, crossed that crowded dock in New York, and tried, somehow, to rebuild their lives in a country that had only ever existed for them on postcards and in stories. You take the ship across the Atlantic, not Titanic this time, not even a White Star vessel, just a working-class liner, slow and forgettable, the kind no one writes songs about. It feels safer that way. The Statue of Liberty looms up out of the morning fog as you approach Ellis Island. You're standing among immigrants, mostly poor, mostly exhausted, some still seasick from the long crossing. You hear 6 different languages before breakfast. A baby wails against a mother's shoulder. A teenage boy clutches a violin case as if it's the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. You wonder, not for the first time, what it would have been like if Titanic had made it here. If those third-class passengers had stepped off the gangway with their new boots and crumpled paper dreams intact. But instead of celebration, there was silence. No cheering crowd, no brass band, just a grim procession of survivors led into a city too shocked to know what to say. You follow their trail through New York's Lower East Side, where so many ended up. A lot of them didn't stay long. They had sponsors, family, work waiting in Chicago, Philadelphia, Denver. But a few stayed right here, and if you know where to look, their footprints are still visible. You meet a man named Hassan, one of the few Syrian immigrants from Titanic's steerage who survived. He doesn't like to talk about that night. He prefers to talk about his fruit stand, how he sells figs in the summer and hot-roasted chestnuts in the winter. But when you ask gently about the ship, he sighs and says, all I remember is cold. That, and the sound of my brother's hand letting go of mine. His brother never made it. Neither did his uncle. He sends money home every month, even though no one asks him to anymore. You spend time with the Chinese survivors too, what little is left of them. There were 8 Chinese men aboard Titanic. 6 survived. But instead of being welcomed, they were swiftly deported under America's Chinese Exclusion Act. No newspapers wrote their names. No public memorials included them. Most of them never spoke of the sinking again. You managed to find one of them in San Francisco, a quiet man who works in shipyards and avoids cameras. He tells you, with a tight smile, we were cargo, not guests. and that's all he says. In Boston, you meet a widow from Belfast who now works as a housekeeper in Beacon Hill. She lost her husband on the Titanic and barely made it to the States. Her story is like so many others. Passage paid by a relative, suitcase full of wool skirts and biscuit tins, a dream pressed flat by reality. Her employer calls her dependable, but a little off. You know what that means. It means she flinches at creaking floorboards and stares too long at sinks full of water. She says America has been kind enough. But when she goes to church, she still prays in whispers. You find the Widener family's home, yes, that Widener family, the ones who lost their heir in first class. Their mansion outside Philadelphia is impossibly large, more a museum than a home. The surviving family members have donated thousands to universities, libraries, charities in their son's name. They don't do interviews, but you're told the lady of the house rarely comes downstairs anymore. She sits in a parlour lined with portraits, staring at a photo of her boy in riding clothes. She's surrounded by luxury, but none of it matters. Grief, you've learned, is the great equaliser. Doesn't matter if you came from a third-class bunk or a mahogany-panelled suite. When someone is gone, they're just gone. In Chicago, you attend a memorial for one of the ship's engineers. It's small, modest, held in a neighbourhood hall with creaky floorboards and a smell of coffee and musty hymnals. Only a handful of people attend, mostly family, a few friends, one elderly man who just wanted to pay his respects, even though he didn't know the deceased. He tells you, I just remember seeing the list, all those names. I figured someone should say something. You stop in Detroit, where a couple of Titanic survivors settled and opened a grocery store. The sign above the door is faded now, but the place is still running, still family-owned. The daughter of one of the original owners tells you her mother never liked the water, never took baths, only showers, even that, not often. She said it was because she got all the water she needed in one night, the daughter says with a wry smile. You nod. You've heard that line before. It's not a joke. It's a wound dressed as humour. In a New Jersey attic, a woman shows you a box of letters written by her grandfather, who had been a second-class passenger. He wrote home every week until the Titanic sank. Then, nothing. He was one of the bodies recovered by the Mackay Bennett. The letters stop abruptly. The last one is dated April 10th, from Southampton, written in good spirits. He talks about the size of the ship, the friendliness of the other passengers, the food. The final sentence reads, I feel like something big is about to happen. You close the box with hands that don't feel like yours anymore. Throughout the trip, you see the aftershocks rippling through immigrant communities, train depots, docks, and dinner tables. People who never stepped foot on the ship are changed by it. People who only lost a cousin or a friend of a friend still wear the grief like a borrowed coat. It doesn't quite fit, but they carry it anyway. The Titanic had no destination. Not really. It promised arrival, but what it delivered, in the end, was dispersion. Its survivors scattered like ashes in the wind, across cities and countries, into jobs and marriages and memories they didn't ask to carry. Some of them built lives, strong and tall. Some of them crumbled quietly. All of them, though, left traces. You return to New York before heading back across the Atlantic. You visit the docks again, the same spot where the Carpathia arrived with its ghost cargo of living and dead. There's no plaque, no memorial, just a stretch of concrete and water. You sit there for a long time, watching the ferry boats glide past. Somewhere nearby, someone's laughing. Somewhere else, a child is crying. The city moves on, but you don't. Not yet. You arrive at the museum on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of day where your coat clings to you and your thoughts feel heavier than usual. The building is quiet, tucked between a row of stone-faced civic institutions, none of which quite match the gravity of what waits inside. There's no flashy sign, no carnival atmosphere, just a modest banner out front, maritime safety through the ages. You step inside, not expecting much, and yet, as you walk deeper into the exhibit, you find yourself standing in front of something that stops you cold. A lifeboat, an actual one, from the Titanic. You didn't expect it to still exist, preserved like this, years later. It's smaller than you remember, but then again, everything always is when it's safe and still and sitting under electric lighting. The plaque next to it says it's lifeboat number 1, one of the first to leave, the controversial one, The one that launched with only a dozen people inside, though it could have held 40. First class, mostly men, crewmen, a baroness, all saved, while others clung to the railings or preyed on the tilting decks. The hull is weathered. Wood grain worn soft by time. You can see where the oars were lashed, where rope once pulled it away from the dying ship. There are scratches along the inside like claw marks. You stare at those, wondering who made them. Were they made in panic? In resistance? Did someone try to jump out or back in? A docent appears beside you, grey-haired, gentle voice, probably used to school tours and sleepy tourists. She tells you the lifeboat was recovered days later, adrift at sea. Most of the survivors had already been transferred. The boat itself was taken back to England, cleaned, stored, forgotten, then rediscovered in a warehouse decades later. Most people don't realise how few lifeboats Titanic had, she says. Not nearly enough for everyone. You nod. That much you know all too well. In the next room, there's a full-scale replica of the ship's boat deck. It's unnerving how carefully they've rebuilt it. The white railings, the wooden slats underfoot, the davits where the lifeboats once hung. You walk the length of it slowly, gripping the railing as if the floor might suddenly tilt beneath you again. For a moment you can hear the voices, the arguments, the sobbing, the confusion as passengers were told to board, just as a precaution. You remember the ridiculousness of it, the absurdity of being asked to leave a ship that didn't seem damaged. No one had told you she was sinking, not yet. The exhibit makes no attempt to hide the failure. It points it out in bold letters, etched into black panels. Only 20 lifeboats for 2,200 passengers. A second line reads, "The minimum required by law at the time, for a ship 1/3 Titanic size." You feel your throat tighten, not because it's news, but because seeing it there, carved into stone, feels like a belated confession, one that came decades too late. You learn that after the disaster, lifeboat laws changed around the world. Suddenly, every passenger ship was required to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. No exceptions. That seems obvious now, laughably so. But back then, they argued it would clutter the decks, disrupt the view, undermine passengers' confidence. You shake your head. Confidence. That had been the real currency on Titanic. Not gold, not class. Confidence. And they'd gambled it away. You move on through the exhibit. There are blueprints of other ships built after 1912. You see how design shifted, how bulkheads were extended higher, how emergency, drills became mandatory, how wireless operators were required to work 24/7. There's a diagram showing how Titanic's lifeboats were supposed to be filled. Orderly, by class, by deck, women and children first. You laugh, softly, because you were there, and it wasn't orderly. It was desperation disguised as etiquette. In a glass case you spot something familiar. A folded canvas lifeboat cover. The kind used on collapsible boats like A and B. The ones found half sunk, with people clinging to their sides. You remember hearing that one of those boats washed ashore in Ireland months later, still carrying the frozen bodies of its last passengers. No names, just numbers. You don't want to dwell on that one. It hits too close. There's an interactive display that lets visitors test how many people can safely board a lifeboat. Children love it. They drag digital figures into the boat, giggling when it capsizes. You stand to the side, watching quietly, wishing they understood. But maybe it's better that they don't. Maybe their laughter is a kind of freedom you lost long ago. You find a corner of the museum devoted to passenger testimonies, audio recordings from survivors, now crackly and faint with age. One voice, a woman, says softly, "When I climbed into the boat, I left my whole world behind." Another voice, a man, says, "We waited for orders, but no orders came." A third voice just says, "I remember the stars. I remember how quiet it got." You sit there for a long time, listening. When you stand up again, your legs feel heavy. Not from age, but from memory. You walk back to the lifeboat room and sit on the bench across from lifeboat number 1. No one else is in the gallery. Just you and this vessel, this blunt wooden witness. You think about the crew who launched it, the officers who obeyed orders they didn't believe in, the passengers who sat in it in eerie silence drifting away from the lights of a dying ship. You wonder if they knew what that lifeboat would become, not just their salvation, but their judgment. You try to imagine how it felt, sitting in that boat, hearing the screams from the water and not turning back. You remember how that silence sounded, how it still echoes. You leave the museum in the late afternoon. The rain has stopped, but the clouds remain. You step out into a world that has learned, at least a little, from the disaster you lived through. Ships today carry more lifeboats than they need. Passengers are shown safety procedures before the ship even casts off. People wear life vests during drills. No one scoffs anymore when they hear the words "just in case." That, you think, is the quiet legacy of Titanic. Not the movies, not the music, not the myths, but a wooden boat behind glass, and the changes it forced the world to make. You glance back at the museum once more before walking away, and you think, let this never happen again. You're staring at the ocean again, but this time, it's not from the deck of a luxury liner or the wooden bench of a museum. It's from the cramped quarters of a Coast Guard cutter, rocking gently somewhere off the coast of Newfoundland. The air smells like salt and diesel, and every surface hums with low mechanical life. You've been invited along unofficially as a guest of the International Ice Patrol, an organisation that didn't exist until after your ship went down. A handful of sailors, a radar technician, and a wiry woman named Commander Reyes make up today's crew. They greet you like someone who's seen the ghost they're still chasing. The patrol was founded in 1914, just 2 years after Titanic's sinking, and it's been out here every season since, scanning the North Atlantic for drifting ice. Icebergs that could, if history were to cruelly repeat itself, rip open another ship's hull and sentence its passengers to the coldest grave imaginable. You ask Reyes why she does this, and she smiles without humour. Because somebody didn't, she says. You look out at the grey water, trying to imagine what it looked like that night. The stars, the stillness, the iceberg. You ask yourself if it would have mattered, if someone like Reyes had been out here back then, if radar had existed, if the patrols had been flying overhead. And part of you wants to say yes, of course. It would have changed everything. But part of you knows how stubborn the world can be, how men once received iceberg warnings and simply kept going. The cutter rocks a little harder as they throttle toward a GPS-marked patch. They've spotted an iceberg on satellite images, nothing huge but big enough to damage a modern vessel. You're allowed on the bridge while the crew locates it. One of the officers, a weathered man named Oates, points at the radar blip like it's a returning enemy. There she is, he mutters. You hear it. That old habit of giving ships and icebergs the same pronouns, as if everything out here is a character in a long cold play. Through binoculars, you spot the shape. White, jagged, ancient. It's beautiful in the way glaciers are, carved by time, gleaming like bone against the ocean's skin. The crew snaps photos, logs coordinates, and updates the international alert system. Merchant ships nearby will adjust course. Planes flying overhead will relay the warning to other vessels. It's all so methodical now, so careful. The cost of getting it wrong is too well known. You remember reading that, before Titanic, no one really paid attention to ice. It was considered an inconvenience, not a threat. Captains assumed that sheer tonnage and speed were enough. But then came the night the ocean proved otherwise, and now there are laws, patrols, international agreements. Now the ice is treated with respect. Reyes tells you that the patrol used to drop dye markers on icebergs during World War II, bright green trails to track their drift. Later they tried sonar, then satellites. Now they rely on a blend of old and new, visual confirmation plus high-tech mapping. The tech gets better, she says, but the ice doesn't care. You ask how many ships they've saved. She shrugs. Hard to say. We scare them off before they get too close, so probably all of them. That night you share a cramped dinner with the crew, metal trays, strong coffee, a pot of stew that smells better than it looks. They talk shop mostly. Weather, ice behaviour, changes in currents. You realise how different this feels from your first voyage across the Atlantic. Back then, it was about elegance, opulence, breaking records. Now it's about watching, waiting, predicting. Maybe that's progress. Maybe it's just realism dressed up in safety vests. One of the younger crew members, a radar tech named Vic, asks what it was like. You hesitate. You've told the story before. Too many times, maybe. But tonight, Among these guardians of the sea, it feels different. You tell them what it sounded like when the iceberg scraped the hull, how the decks shuddered, how no one believed at first that anything serious had happened, how it went from mild curiosity to mass panic in under an hour. You describe the cold, the silence, the strange unshakable memory of lights flickering underwater. No one interrupts. No one tries to correct you. They've all read the reports, seen the movies, maybe even memorized the official transcript of the final radio signals. But hearing it from someone who was there, someone who heard the last notes of the orchestra as the ship dipped into darkness, it's different, more human, more awful. Later, Reyes finds you outside, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching the horizon for nothing in particular. She hands you a metal mug of tea and stands beside you. "You know," she says, "every time I look at one of those bergs, I wonder if it's the same one. The one that hit your ship." You smile grimly. "Wouldn't that be something?" She takes a sip. "Of course. The real one probably melted years ago, drifted south, gone. But the idea sticks with you, that maybe, somewhere in the slow turning of the ocean's cycles, a part of it still exists, not the shape, not the bulk, but the story, the weight of what it did." The next day, the cutter receives a call from another ship. A cargo freighter has reported an unexpected sighting near its route. The crew snaps into action. Charts unfurl, coordinates crackle over the radio, engines rumble to life. You feel that old tension in your chest again. But this time it's paired with something else. Gratitude. Because now someone is watching. Now someone answers. You spend one more night aboard, drifting in your narrow bunk, the hum of the ship beneath you like a heartbeat. You think about how Titanic had no such patrol, how her radio warnings were dismissed, how icebergs were thought to drift south and vanish harmlessly. But they didn't vanish. They waited. In the morning, as the cutter turns back toward port, Reyes shakes your hand and says, "Glad you came. History matters out here. It keeps us honest." You nod. And for the first time in a long while, you believe her. You step off the ship and onto solid ground, leaving behind the cutters and currents and clouds. But as you walk away, you realise you've left something else out there too, a piece of the night you never really let go of. It floats now, somewhere near the radar's edge, watched over by people who will never let it sneak up on the world again. You're standing at a dockyard in Nova Scotia now, boots crunching on gravel, staring at a wall of maps that don't quite agree with each other. Everyone's been telling you the same thing for weeks. The wreck is still out there. You knew that, of course. You were there when she went down. But there's something different about being back in the same stretch of ocean, this time with sonar, charts, and men with theories instead of lifeboats. The Titanic didn't just vanish. She slid into the dark, dragging thousands of tons of steel, timber, luggage, coal, and stories with her. For decades, no one knew exactly where she landed. She wasn't marked with a tidy red X. The ship slipped below the surface and into legend. And like all legends, people wanted to find her again. Not to save anyone, not anymore, but to know, to see. The first thing you realise is just how wrong the early reports were. The last radioed coordinates were off by miles. Survivors had guessed, newspapers speculated, and even seasoned captains scratched their heads. The Atlantic is vast, and the Titanic didn't sink with ceremony. It sank in chaos, the stern spiralling, the bow plunging, the lights blinking out. By the time the Carpathia arrived, there was nothing left but lifeboats and debris. The sea had swallowed its secret, and so, for years, people guessed. You meet one of them, a thin, weather-beaten man named Everett who's been looking for Titanic since the 1950s. He has maps with coffee stains older than you'd like to guess. His hands shake, but his voice doesn't. They all thought it was somewhere obvious, he says, but they didn't account for the current. He pulls out a dog-eared notebook and flips it open. She drifted as she sank. Not much, but enough. You follow him into a small shack of a building that smells like salt, oil, and desperation. On the wall is a framed article from 1963, featuring his younger self standing on the deck of a tiny boat, holding a stick with a makeshift depth probe. The headline reads, "Local man convinced he's found Titanic." He hadn't, of course, not yet, but that didn't stop him. He sold his car, his house. He bought a battered fishing vessel and installed sonar equipment he could barely afford. For years he wandered over the same square miles of sea, marking sonar blips and muttering to himself. You ask him why. He grins, toothless and wide-eyed. Because I owe her something, he says. He's not alone. In the 1970s, entire expeditions were launched. Some government-sponsored, some crowd-funded, some laughably amateur. One group tried dragging underwater cameras behind fishing boats. Another claimed to have found her, only to realise they'd actually located a pile of volcanic rocks. The ocean is good at playing tricks. You meet a woman named Lena, who was part of one of the early underwater photography crews. She shows you a grainy image of what looks like nothing, but she insists it was a boiler. "We were close," she whispers, running a finger across the black and white print. "So close I could feel it." Each new rumour brought more dreamers, more boats, more sonar scans. The North Atlantic became a hunting ground for ghost chasers. But the deeper they went, the quieter the ocean got. It's not like the movies. Down there, 2.5 miles deep, it's pitch black. Pressure so intense it would crush a car like a soda can. There are no footprints, no trail of breadcrumbs, just mud and silence. Still, they searched, and each false alarm only fed the hunger. You spend hours with old newspaper clippings and expedition logs. One man claimed he found the wreck using psychic powers. Another said the ship didn't sink at all. It was swapped with her sister ship, the Olympic, as part of an insurance scam. You laugh out loud when you read that one, not because it's funny, but because it's so desperate. People couldn't accept what happened, so they made up something more exciting, less painful, but others got closer. In the early 1980s, French and American teams start coordinating. Serious technology now. Deep-sea submersibles, side-scan sonar, months of prep. They launch expedition after expedition, learning from each failure. Then one day there's a sonar hit. An unusual formation on the ocean floor, the kind that doesn't occur naturally. A wreck. You feel it in your chest even reading the report. Even though you know what comes next, your breath catches. Because this is where memory meets metal. Where the nightmare you lived becomes something real again. Not just a story whispered in gasps or a name etched in a memorial. They found her. You talk to one of the engineers who was part of that final discovery team. He tells you what it felt like when the camera feed first picked up the unmistakable shape of a boiler lying half buried in silt. Then, steel walls, portholes, rivets. They didn't find the ship intact. She was broken in two, bow and stern separated by hundreds of meters, surrounded by a debris field of shoes, crockery and twisted metal. But she was there. The Titanic had returned, not to the surface, but to the world. You see the footage, blurry, haunting, a staircase leading nowhere, a porcelain doll's head resting in the sand, a shoe still laced, pointing toward nothing, and then the bow, still majestic, still terrifying, like it's waiting for something. You remember walking those decks. You remember the sound of polished shoes tapping on wood. You remember laughter, and then silence. Now it's all silent. The wreck lies under miles of water and pressure, slowly eroding, rusted to lace, colonized by strange microbes that eat iron. The ocean is taking her back bit by bit. Scientists call these formations rusticles, and they move like time-lapse barnacles, dissolving the Titanic into dust over the decades. There's an open debate now. Should we try to preserve it, or let it rest? Some say it's a grave, others say it's history, a few call it both. You don't answer when they ask your opinion, not out loud. You just look at the images again and whisper the names you remember. Not the ships, the peoples, because the wreck isn't just a ship, it's a memorial, a reminder, a wound, still open, still drifting just out of reach. It's 1985, and you're back at sea, but this time you're inside a submarine. Not a war machine, not a Hollywood prop, but something quieter, sleeker, more precise. The kind of vessel that descends not for conquest, but for revelation. You're wedged beside a pilot and a researcher named Anya, both strapped in with headphones and thick notebooks, voices hushed and reverent. The pressure gauge ticks upward as you descend, slowly, meter by meter, until the light from the surface disappears entirely. You've seen the ocean from above, of course, seen it swallow a ship whole, But now you're seeing it from below, the deep, the place Titanic landed. There's nothing here but blackness, not darkness, blackness, a kind of void that drinks light. You drift past creatures that glow in the dark, mouths full of transparent teeth, bodies shaped by gravity and pressure and time. Some of them have never seen the surface. You imagine they never will. The submersible moves in silence. Everyone is watching the screens, squinting at sonar pings and camera feeds. No one speaks until Anya whispers, "There, just that." A single word, barely audible, but it's enough. You lean in. At first it's just a shadow, then a slope, then a curve of steel so massive, so unmistakable, that your breath catches in your throat. The bow, Titanic's bow. It rises from the ocean floor like a cathedral buried in ash, covered in rust, draped in decay, but still proud, still iconic. The railings are intact. The anchor chains drape like forgotten necklaces. The starboard anchor lies still in its pocket. You don't cry, not exactly, but your hands tremble. You hadn't expected this. You thought you'd be looking at wreckage. You didn't realise you'd be looking at a ghost. The sub circles slowly. Floodlights carve the darkness into sharp-edged shapes. You pass over a promenade deck, now collapsed inward like a mouth frozen mid-sentence. You see open portholes, bent girders, the steel skeleton of the crow's nest where lookouts once scanned the sea in vain. Then comes the stern, or what's left of it. It's a twisted nightmare of debris, ripped steel, exploded decking, a tangle of machinery and coal and splintered beams. Where the bow is solemn, the stern is chaos. It's not a clean break. The ship was torn in two as it sank, each half spiralling separately to the seafloor. The impact shattered the stern on descent. It looks like it exploded, and in a way it did. Internal pressures buckling outward, tearing through floors and bulkheads. You can barely tell what it once was. In the field between bow and stern lie the belongings of the lost. A child's shoe, a silver comb, a porcelain cup with White Star Line's insignia, still faintly visible. These are the details that pierce deeper than anything else. Not the steel, not the numbers, the intimacy of it. You see a pocket watch stopped at 2:20 a.m., the moment Titanic fully disappeared beneath the surface. There's no human remains, not anymore. The sea took those long ago. But the human presence is still here, tangible. The ocean floor is their final resting place, and somehow you feel like you've just stumbled into a sacred hall. Anya tells you softly that people were surprised when the ship was found in two pieces. For decades, the official story said she went down intact. That belief shaped everything. Testimony, art, film. But now, the evidence lies in front of you, covered in silt. A stern blown apart by implosion, a bow nestled like a sleeping beast. The scientists are thrilled. The press will go wild. But you're not here for that. You're here because you needed to see it. All these years, the memory has played in your mind like a film loop. Lifeboats lowering, deck chairs sliding, the band playing their final notes. But this is real. Not imagined, not romanticized. Cold steel and darker truths. It's one thing to survive the sinking. It's another to come face to face with the bones of the ship that nearly buried you. You float there for hours, or maybe it's minutes. Time means nothing down here. The pilot finally turns the sub away. You watch Titanic recede into darkness again. The last thing you see is the anchor chain vanishing into silt. Then, blackness. Later, when you're back on deck in the open air, people are clapping and shaking hands. It's a scientific triumph. History recovered. But for you, it doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like closure laced with sorrow, the kind that presses behind your eyes and doesn't ask for permission. There's a debate forming already. What to do with the wreck now that it's been found? Some want to raise pieces of it. Others demand it be left alone. There are murmurs about tourist expeditions, about collectible artifacts, about exhibits. You remember one voice in the planning room calling it the biggest museum underwater. Another called it just scrap metal. You said nothing. Because for you, it isn't either. It's the last room you ever walked through on that ship. The last bed you slept in. The last sound of laughter before water claimed it. It's not an exhibit. It's not treasure. It's the final breath of over 2,000 people who didn't get another morning. You write a letter later that week, addressed to no one, maybe to the sea itself. You kept her safe for all these years. You kept her hidden. But now the world can see what we lost. Please let them be gentle. You knew this part would come. It was inevitable, really. Humans can't leave anything alone, not even the dead. And so, after the silence, after the solemn discovery, came the rush. The treasure hunters, the curious, the opportunists, the well-meaning preservationists, and the full-blown Titanic superfans. They all wanted something from the wreck. Not everyone wanted the same thing, but they all wanted. You're standing now inside a gleaming exhibit hall staring at a glass case holding a dainty bracelet engraved with the name Amy. Just Amy. No last name, no title, no backstory. The tag says it was recovered from the Titanic's debris field in 1987. It's been cleaned, polished, photographed, catalogued. You can even buy a postcard of it in the gift shop if you want. You do not want. A little boy nearby is tugging at his dad's coat, pointing at a set of recovered dining utensils and saying, "So this was from the ship that crashed." The dad corrects him. "Sank. It sank." The boy shrugs and moves on, distracted by the recreation of a grand staircase nearby, where you can take a photo for $20. The sign says, "Feel what it was like to be on the Titanic." You want to ask them, did the staircase creak when it tilted? Did the chandelier swing as people screamed? But you don't. You just move to the next exhibit, which features a chunk of Titanic's hull, a literal slab of her body winched from the deep and mounted like a trophy. It's enormous. 15 tons of riveted steel, blackened and scarred. There's a small dent near the top that a sign claims may have occurred during the final descent. The steel looks tired, like it's ashamed to be on display. The debate, of course, has never stopped. From the moment the wreck was found in 1985, a divide split down the middle of the Titanic community, to recover or to respect. One side argued that bringing artefacts to the surface would educate, preserve, memorialise. The other side said it was grave robbing, pure and simple. You've heard both arguments, sat in both rooms, one filled with museum curators discussing climate-controlled displays and cultural legacy, the other filled with family members of the dead, hands trembling, voices cracking, saying leave it where it lies. But the salvage teams were already out there. One of them, RMS Titanic Inc., received the salvage rights and began what they called a recovery mission and what others called a gold rush. They brought up over 5,000 artefacts in the decades that followed. Perfume vials, dinner plates, a violin, clothing, a leather suitcase that remarkably had kept its contents intact thanks to the tannins in the leather. Some items were displayed respectfully, some were auctioned off, others disappeared into private collections where you imagine they sit now, collecting dust under soft museum lights or behind glass cabinets in someone's study, far from the ocean that held them for 70 years. You met one of the divers once, a soft-spoken man named Eric who told you, "When I saw a pair of shoes on the seabed, I stopped moving. Just stopped. Because I realised the person who wore them was still there, just gone." He never went back after that, but many did. Commercial submersible tours were offered for a hefty price. Tourists in jumpsuits and camera crews descending into the deep to glimpse the broken ship. Some called it a pilgrimage, others called it a selfie opportunity. You saw a woman once on TV crying in front of a porthole and saying, "I feel her energy down here." You wanted to ask her whose energy she meant, the ship's, or the people who died clawing at those same portholes. Then came the tragedy of the Titan submersible years later, a private tour that ended in implosion. 5 people gone in an instant, their remains unrecoverable. It brought Titanic back into the headlines again, the old tragedy folding into a new one. People debated the ethics of even visiting the site. News anchors said it was a cautionary tale. Some wag on the internet called it the price of poking ghosts. But no one really stopped. You're invited to a private viewing of an artefact archive in London, a behind-the-scenes look. The curator, a polite man with elbow patches and a voice like an audiobook narrator, shows you a drawer of labelled personal effects. A woman's compact mirror, dented but still reflective, a shaving brush, a boarding pass, each item catalogued, climate-controlled, insured. You ask him if he ever feels like he's handling memories. He pauses, then says, We try not to think of them that way. We think of them as evidence. You want to say that they're both, evidence and memory, the sharp and the soft, but you don't. You just run your finger along the edge of the display case and try to imagine the hand that once held that mirror. Were they in first class or steerage? Did they die quickly or drift for hours? Did they scream? You've also met people who treasure the recovered objects. They say it's their way of connecting, that holding a fork or seeing a pair of boots in a case makes the story real to them. Tangible. Teachable. You understand that. Not everyone can sit with memory the way you can. Not everyone has to. Still, you can't shake the feeling that the wreck is shrinking. Not just physically, though it is, crumbling faster now thanks to human interference and bacteria, but spiritually. Each item brought up is a piece of her removed. Each tour, each documentary, each auction chips away at the silence, at the sacred. You return one last time to a small museum in Halifax. Here, there are no recreations, no grand staircases, no gift shops, just rows of shoes, glasses, watches. Personal items recovered from the bodies found at sea. These aren't artifacts, they're remnants, fragments. And no one is posing for photos. The silence in the room is heavy, honest. You find a pair of kids' shoes, scuffed, too small, tied neatly at the laces. You close your eyes and remember the boy on the lifeboat who wouldn't let go of his sister's hand. You don't know if these were his. You don't want to know. Maybe, in the end, the question isn't whether we should raise the Titanic or leave her alone. Maybe the question is whether we're capable of remembering her without turning her into something we can sell. As you leave the museum, you pass a family in the hallway. A little girl points at a photograph of the ship and asks her father, "Is that the one that sank?" He nods. She frowns and says, "That's so sad." And you think, maybe that's enough. You've been walking for hours before you realise where your feet are taking you. It's a bright, cold morning in Belfast and the air smells faintly of iron and sea salt. The streets are clean, a little too quiet, like the city itself is holding its breath. Ahead of you rises a building shaped like an enormous shard of metal, all sharp angles and gleaming aluminum, modern, stunning, and deliberate. It's the Titanic Belfast Museum, sitting on the exact site where the ship was built over a century ago. It's strange, standing on this ground again. Not the decks of Titanic herself, but the birthplace, the dry dock, the slipways, the workshops that forged her bones. You imagine the hammering, the shouting, the heat of it all. Thousands of workers building something they believed would outlast them all. Now their work has been turned into an experience, a legacy, a lesson. You enter the museum. It's part exhibit, part tribute, part time machine. The design is immersive, almost theatrical. Rooms shift in light and sound as you move through them, each section marking a different phase of Titanic's life. Her design, her construction, her voyage, her end. You pass displays of engineering drawings, renders of cabins, letters from Harland and Wolff shipbuilders. One note reads, "She will be the pride of the White Star Line." You stand in front of that line for a long time, because she was, until she wasn't. The construction gallery rises vertically. You step into a glass elevator that lifts you through the scaffolding, mimicking the height of Titanic's hull. There's a voiceover playing, quotes from builders, engineers, labourers. You listen to their words and feel the pride in them. No one built this ship to fail. No one thought she would vanish. But pride, you've learned, is no life raft. Later, you stand at a digital display, showing a roster of every passenger aboard. Names scroll past in gold and grey. You touch one, Sarah Ahmed, a third-class passenger from Syria, travelling with her husband and child. Only her husband survived. Her story is one of thousands. Some passengers were famous, most were not. But the sea does not recognise fame, it recognises weight and silence. You wander into a dark room where a giant screen shows the ocean floor in real-time rendered animation. The wreck lies motionless, silted over, decaying by degrees. Occasionally bubbles or ghost-like fish drift across the screen. It's peaceful. It's awful. A recorded voice says, "Eventually, Titanic will be gone completely. Only memory will remain." You think about that. You think about how many versions of this story you've heard over the years. Some accurate, some invented. The boy who dressed as a woman to escape, the millionaire who refused to leave his valet behind, the priest who gave last rites as the water rose, the band playing till the end, the baker who drank himself warm and swam for hours. So many stories, some true, some wishful, some both. You step outside again, where the wind cuts across the old slipway. Metal outlines on the ground mark where Titanic once stood, her size, her scope, her symmetry. You walk her length, from bow to stern. Children laugh as they chase each other along the outline, unaware that they're dancing on a grave. It doesn't bother you, not anymore. They don't need to carry the weight of it, not yet. Nearby is a statue, Titanica, a woman in bronze, arms outstretched as if to fly or fall. Her face is serene, caught between joy and surrender. You sit beside her for a while, the sound of distant gulls circling above. Behind her, the museum looms like the ship it honours, shaped like the bow, pointing toward the sea she never reached. And you ask yourself, why does Titanic still matter so much? Because she was the biggest? Because she was called unsinkable? Because she took the rich and poor down together? Or is it because we see ourselves in her, our ambition, our arrogance, our frailty? Titanic was supposed to be a triumph of man over nature. Instead, she became the ultimate reminder that nature always wins, that steel bends, that messages go unread, that there's never enough time, or boats, or mercy. And yet, even in the disaster, there were moments of grace. A steward who carried children through the corridors to safety, a wireless operator who sent distress signals until the water shorted out his system, strangers who held hands in the final minutes, having met just hours before, survivors who devoted their lives to making sure the dead were remembered, people like you walking back into memory again and again because forgetting would feel like betrayal. You visit one last room before you go. It's quieter than the rest. No touchscreens, no videos, no music, just a wall of names. First class, second, third, crew, musicians, engineers, firemen, waiters, children, stewards, mothers, lovers, everyone. You run your fingers along the engraved letters. There's no separation, no hierarchy, just names. Equal now. You whisper one, then another, then one more. You don't cry, not this time. You step out into the daylight again, blinking against the sudden brightness. The gulls are still crying overhead. The harbour still stretches out toward the open sea. The slipway gleams beneath your feet. You walk away slowly, past the statue, past the museum, past the ghost of a ship that still sails through time, carrying her stories, her mistakes, her martyrs. And you think, not for the first time, and certainly not the last, may we always remember, and may we never repeat. And now you're back where you began. Not on a deck, not in a lifeboat, not in a museum or submersible, but somewhere quieter. Maybe your room, maybe your mind. The journey's over, though of course Titanic's never really ends. That's the strange thing about this story. It doesn't rest. It keeps floating up year after year, like a message in a bottle that the world just can't stop opening. You lie back, eyes closed, and let it all drift. The cold Atlantic, the creaking beams, the distant wail of a lifeboat whistle, the silence after. You remember the people more than the ship, their laughter, their fear, their impossible strength, the way some of them never let go, the way others did. You think about how easy it would be to turn Titanic into just another cautionary tale, a monument to arrogance, a reminder that hubris always pays the price. But you know better now. You've walked her decks, stood beside her rusting bones, listened to her echoes in courtrooms, attics and dreams. Titanic isn't just a warning, she's a mirror, one that shows us who we are when the lights go out, when the music stops and the water rises. Sometimes we're brave, sometimes we panic, sometimes we jump, and sometimes, miraculously, we survive. That's what you carry with you now, not just the tragedy, but the aftermath, the long aching stretch of human effort that followed, the reforms, the remembrance, the resistance to letting it all vanish into myth. You open your eyes and let out a breath, soft, slow. Somewhere, a clock ticks. Somewhere, maybe even now, an iceberg floats in silence. But here, in this moment, you're safe. and the story can sleep